in Senegal. I see we have folks in Accra, Ghana. Thanks for joining us. Chicago, Rome, many people in Dakar, New York, Washington, DC. I know it's quite early over there. Thank you for joining us. Abuja, Kigali, Kampala, Haymad, Pretoria. Keep them coming, keep them coming. Thank you so much for joining us. Atlanta, Georgia, Addis Ababa, and so much more. We have over 23 organizations attending this event, and one of the highlights would be the launch of the 2021 Annual Trends and Outlook Report. So stay tuned, stay with us for this 3-day virtual event. A couple of things to note: this meeting is being recorded, and please monitor the chat box throughout the meeting. We will be sharing ATOR related resources during each panel conversation. Also, we have interpretation services available for this meeting. If you need translation, please turn out the interpretation feature on your screen. And finally, join the conversation on social media. We have 2 hashtags, 2021 RESACS and 2021 ATOR. So there you have it. Time to begin the debate. It's my absolute pleasure and honor to hand over to the chair of the opening plenary. She is a distinguished fellow of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. She's equally the CEO and founder of Food Systems for the Future and vice chair of Academia 2063's Board of Trustees, Ambassador Etherine Cousin.
Thank you so much, Lahia, for that wonderful introduction, and welcome to everyone to this year's exciting and very thoughtful conference. I'm sure we will all learn so much from the participation of our speakers and from the participation of each of you. Let's just go right into it. I am honored this morning to recognize Her Excellency, Ambassador Sacco, the Commissioner for the Department of Agriculture, Rural Development, Blue Economy, and Sustainable Environment from the African Union Commission. Thank you so much for co-hosting this today with Academia 2063. And we also have the presence of Ms. Maura Berry, the Senior Director and Assistant Administrator for the Bureau for Resilience and Food Security at the United States Agency for International Development, USAID. Dr. Ousmane Badiane, the Executive Chairperson and our other co-host of today's event, Academia 2063. Distinguished keynote speakers, ladies and gentlemen, all protocols observed. Please allow me to introduce our first speaker this morning, Dr. Ousmane Badiane, for his opening statement.
Thank you very much, Etherine. Thank you again for joining us. And good morning and good afternoon to everybody who is here with us today. Let me also start by saying again, thank you very much to Her Excellency Ambassador Joseph Sacco for the very strong and high quality partnership that Academia 2063 has enjoyed over the years with the Commission. It's a pleasure and an honor for us to be supporting her effort and that of her department and her entire team in moving the African agenda forward. So thank you very much for making time and for joining us here today. Let me also say a warm welcome and thank you to Senior Deputy Assistant Administrator Maura Berry for also gracing us here with the presence today, for being available, and of course for the support the agency has provided, not just to Academia 2063, but the overall African Union agenda around agriculture since the birth of CADEP nearly 20 years ago. We are happy and pleased to have with us our former colleague and friend, Dr. Maximo Torero, Senior Economist of FAO. Thank you and welcome. Professor Cheryl Hendricks of University of Pretoria, thank you and welcome for joining us. And we look forward to also welcoming Dr. Ismahan Al-Wafi, Chief Scientist of FAO. Let me also start by saying a big thanks to the team of editors who brought the reports together, along with our own Department of Communications and technical team who worked tirelessly to put out another excellent report this year. So thank you to all of you for your very hard work. And of course, thank you to those who put this session here today together. The report is dealing with rebuilding after COVID. And I think in this case for us, COVID is just an example of the kind of shocks to come. We have had them in the past. They may be more intense and more frequent in the future, but we know that our economies will be tested. We know that our communities and our ecosystems will be tested. So learning from this massive shock that was COVID probably provide us with the opportunity to know where we are vulnerable, where we are resilient, and where we need to do a little bit more to advance and prevent massive pain taking place after shocks like that. COVID is indeed unprecedented. It is a very complex and wide-ranging crisis. It has in itself features of all the major crises we have had over the last couple of decades. Of course, it is a health crisis like Ebola was, but also has disrupted trade like we had in the global food price crisis a couple of years ago. It has put under a lot of stress the global financial systems as we had during the finance-related crisis of a few years ago. It has impact on production systems like droughts or floods would have. So it really had in itself everything that we have dealt with over the last few decades. And that's why its ramifications were vast and therefore a good opportunity for us to understand what really worked in helping us withstand the impact of COVID, but also where we need to do better. And I think this report, with all its chapters, with a first-rate set of authors and contributors, provide a mine in terms of a gold mine, in terms of what's in there for evidence and lessons for us to capture and draw on as we face future crises. Would like to also here thank all the contributors who are going to be presenting from today over the next 2 to 3 days, actually, the work and the content of this HR. So we are happy and pleased to be here. What you will see on day 3 as well is the report takes stock every year of the progress made in pursuit of the Malabo targets and goals. We have made a lot of progress over the last 20 years. COVID has set us back a little bit, but even before COVID, there were some indications that we are getting either tired or we're just taking our foot off the gas pedal. It looks like COVID has just brought to the fore what we needed to do anyway in scaling up efforts, redoubling commitments in terms of public expenditure, in terms of working to accelerate growth in agriculture, in terms of continuing the very impactful and effective reforms, institutional as well as policy, that were ushered in by CADEP. We need to get back to all of that. COVID was, I guess, a reminder to all of us that there's so much more that we need to do. So thank you to everybody who joined us here. Thank you, and I turn the floor back to Ambassador Etherin Cousin. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Usman, for those very thoughtful remarks and for getting us started this morning in such a strong manner. I'm so looking forward to seeing the report, which will, as you say, give us the information of where we need to do better as we move forward in addressing the challenges that were so illuminated during the COVID period. I now have the pleasure of turning to Ms. Maura Berry from USAID for her opening comments. Ms. Berry.
Thank you, Ambassador Cousin, very much. Thanks for the introduction. And it's a pleasure to be here. I'm calling in from Washington, D.C. And if I can just follow what you said earlier, all protocols observed. It's really great to be here. I was here last year for the event, so it's great to be invited back to say a few words again this year. And the theme of the resilient food systems post-COVID, of course, couldn't be more timely and relevant, as Dr. Badian pointed out. As President Biden articulated at the UN General Assembly and at COP26, building resilient and sustainable food systems while tackling climate change are top priorities for the US government. And since COP26 is really fresh on all of our minds, I'd like to start by highlighting the critical importance of combating climate change to strengthening resilient food systems. At COP26, President Biden announced the President's Emergency Plan for Adaptation and Resilience, what we're calling PREPARE. So PREPARE is the largest US commitment ever made to reduce climate impacts in the most vulnerable countries. And it's a whole of government plan, or I would say, all hands on deck, aiming to elevate the importance of adaptation, including climate information, planning for disasters, and mobilizing public and private finance to help developing countries meet the challenges and impacts of the climate crisis. And as part of this PREPARE effort, USAID and the AUC announced at COP26 the Comprehensive Africa Climate Initiative, or what we're calling, because we love our acronyms, right? We're calling it CACI. So CACI is going to support African countries to act on their climate commitments and strengthen adaptation by building technical capacity and providing policy support. Through CACI, we're aiming to leverage the expertise of Academia 2063, along with the regional network of agricultural policy research institutes, so that we can support African countries to implement their national determined contributions, their NDCs, as well as the development of national adaptation plans under the Paris Agreement. So this support is aligned with and strengthens the existing process, including through RESACs and the Comprehensive Agricultural Development Program, CADP. So we recognize really that CADP, the framework, embraces climate smart agriculture as a key pillar to strengthening climate resilience. So further to that, we also commend the members of the Committee for African Heads of State and Government on Climate Change who have signaled commitment to climate action by ratifying the Paris Agreement in their countries. And to further coordinate an international effort, we're calling on partner countries and organizations to join the Global Initiative Agricultural Innovation Mission for Climate, or what we are calling AIM4C. And this initiative aims to increase investment in innovation research and development on agriculture and food systems in support of climate action. So these efforts, PREPARE, CACI, AIM4C, they're all part of a larger USAID-wide climate strategy. And that draft strategy is now available online for public review. And we encourage everyone who's participating today, if you haven't already, to go ahead and provide your input, which it's open until November 24th. And in this discussion on food systems resilience, the other key principle that I'd like to highlight is locally led development. Recently, USAID's Administrator Powell laid out USAID's vision for development and really underscored that investments in local partners in countries where we work is critical to that strategy. Our efforts must empower local actors, strengthen local systems, and facilitate local leadership to generate effective and sustainable solutions. USAID's track record of support for local research organizations and think tanks has promoted African-led data analysis and evidence generation across the continent. For example, we partnered with organizations like Agriculture and Rural Perspective Initiative, EPAR, in Senegal to provide analysis and strengthen institutional capacity to improve local food system policies. And with strong support from African political leaders, USAID's Bureau for Resilience and Food Security worked with IFPRI in 2019 to support the establishment of an African-led research organization that would become Academia 2063. And just 1 year into its establishment, Academia 2063 has become one of Africa's premier think tanks with a full research and analytics portfolio to inform policy solutions to the continent's food security and COVID-19 challenges. And from examining price responses of local staple food markets, the predicting agricultural production changes, to analyzing COVID-induced trade disruptions in Africa, and so much more, Academia 2063 has really significantly advanced Africa's ability to meet its own knowledge and evidence needs in support of effective policymaking. And it's why we're honored to continue our support as USAID for RESACS at its new home in Academia 2063. RESACS has always been a knowledge support system for African processes and programs, primarily CADP. And so it is especially fitting that RESACS is housed in an African-led world-class research organization. So in closing my remarks, I just want to emphasize that at USAID, we stand with our African counterparts who have demonstrated leadership in advancing an ambitious African-led policy framework for food systems transformation through the CADP agenda. USAID will continue to partner with African institutions and countries to build resilient and sustainable food systems on the continent. We encourage Academia 2063 and other local organizations to continue building partnerships with the African Union, country governments, and other stakeholders. Your leadership is so critical to apply research and evidence in policymaking and help Africa drive the global conversation around resilient food systems. So thank you again for the opportunity to speak with all of you today, and let me turn it back over to you, Ambassador.
Thank you very much, Senior Deputy Assistant Administrator. It is a pleasure to have you with us again this year, leading on these important issues and providing the support that USAID does to Academia 2063 and to the RESACS program. Please allow me, ladies and gentlemen, to introduce our next speaker, the co-host of today's event, the AU Commissioner, Ambassador Sacco, for her opening welcoming statement. Dr. Sacco.
Thank you. Sorry, I'm having some problem. Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you, Ambassador, for giving me the floor. I stand on the existing protocol. On behalf of the African Union Commission, it gives me pleasure to address the annual RESACS conference. Warm greetings and best wishes from the chairperson of the commission, Mr. Faki Mohammed. I would like to Academia 2063 convening the 2021 conference of the Regional Strategic Analysis and Knowledge Support System, RESACS, amid the raging COVID-19 pandemic. Thank you for giving me an opportunity to deliver introductory remarks for this conference. The Department of Agriculture, Rural Development, Blue Economy, and Sustainable Environment is honored to be a partner of this event. This time of the year is always exciting in view of the launch of the flagship annual Trends and Outlook report that is the key highlights of the conference. I congratulate Academia 2063 for the production of this report and commend the choice of elaborating on the topic subject on the impact of COVID-19 on African economies, the response from member states, and the proposed measure from member states to rebuild more resilient food system. Distinguished participants, COVID-19 pandemic, especially from March 2020, exposed the fragility of the African and global food system alike. Borders were close restriction on at the local level, regional, continental, and international movement of people and goods, the confinement measures imposed by countries prevented farmers from accessing markets to either buy inputs or sell their produce. Entire crop calendars were affected, with negative impacted agricultural production and productivity, leading to food and nutrition insecurity, especially among vulnerable communities. In essence, the pandemic clearly demonstrated multi-sectoral convergence, particularly agriculture, food security, public health, and safety, as well as employment. Lives has been lost and livelihood shattered. But as it seems, it is not all doom and gloom. The pandemic has provided us an opportunity to self-reflection and rethink of our development path. We should recognize this opportunity and rebuild back better, including the need to re-examine the current partnership and aspire for genuine global solidarity and support. We are looking forward to hearing the proposal for short-term, medium-term, and long-term strategy to address the challenges facing the agri-food sector and constrained resilience of African food system. I am keen to know how these strategies speaks to the priority spelled out in the African Common Position presented to the the Food System Summit. Most importantly, I am curious to know how we move forward collectively and urgently to increase the pace of CAADP implementation in order to achieve the Malabo Declaration goal and targets by 2025. All our effort must be geared to supporting our member states develop and implement programs aimed at building resilient food system that will withstand future shocks, because we know that shocks will continue to emerge, especially with climate change. Ladies and gentlemen, with this introduction remark, it is now my singular honor and pleasure to declare open the 2020-21 RISACS conference officially. I wish you a successful deliberation, and I thank you very much for your kind attention.
Thank you, Ambassador, for those very generous comments. Your presence here today signals the importance of this conversation to continuing the transformation of the food system across the continent of Africa, and also the importance of moving beyond COVID to build back better in real terms. I want to thank each of our high-level speakers for those opening remarks and the generous comments that you have given both for this conference as well as for Academia 2063. It is now our opportunity to turn to the plenary discussion with two very important keynote presentations. The first will be delivered by Dr. Maximo Torero, the Chief Economist at the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United States, of the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, FAO. Let me allow him to now present his keynote presentation. Maximo, over to you.
Thank you very much, Catherine, and it's a pleasure for me to be here with you, and thank you for the opportunity to be part of this event. So let me share my screen, and I hope you can see it now. So what I'm going to present in the 2021 RISACS conference is about what is the situation of food security and agricultural trade during the COVID-19 pandemic. And I will try to bring some updates of the latest information we have in addition to what is produced in the chapter of the book. So let me first start with what we know about growth projections in the region based on the latest IMF reporting. As you can see here, what we are expecting is that the world will recover and the advanced economies especially will recover by 2022 to the pre-pandemic levels. But this won't be the case for emerging markets and won't be the case for low-income countries, developing countries. And specifically, if we look at Sub-Saharan Africa, we expect a decrease in growth in 2020 of -1.7 and a recovery in 2021 of 3.7 and by 2022 of 3.8, but lower to the levels pre-pandemic. Now, what are the major concerns that we are looking at that will affect, of course, the region and will affect also food security and nutrition? First, commodity prices. As you can see in the left graph in this slide, the commodity prices for metals are increasing, the same for the case of oil, but also the same for the case of food. And food, we are seeing increases in one staple commodity lately, which is wheat, but we also are seeing increases in high-value commodities. And this is related to the graph in the right-hand side, the consumer price inflation by country group. As you can observe here, since the pandemic, there has been a significant increase of the consumer price index and a consequent inflation that can be applied to least developed countries, developing countries, and also, of course, to emerging economies, the yellow and the red line, and also applies to the core CPI measure, which is the dotted line. So we are seeing some pressure over prices, which is a clear consequence of the increase in demand, especially of the fast recovery of some big developed economies, and which could create some potential issues in terms of food inflation in many of developing countries in Sub-Saharan Africa, especially given that many of them are net food importing countries, and therefore they will be facing challenges in addition to also the potential challenges of exchange rate devaluations. Now, if we take this in context with the significant inequality we have today in terms of vaccination, which vaccinations are far lower than the rates elsewhere for the case of Sub-Saharan Africa. In this graph, we have the rate of vaccination until the 3rd of October, and Africa is in the red dotted line, Sub-Saharan Africa, non-Sub-Saharan Africa in the blue line, and advanced economies in the gray line. So the gap we can see easily in this graph is enormous. And that could have significant consequences, especially in 2021, 2022, and could affect negatively even more the growth or the potential recovery of countries in Sub-Saharan Africa. So this inequality in the access to vaccination is something very important to look at. Now, when we look at the Oxford COVID-19 stringency index, which basically is trying to bring all the measures that were put in place in many African countries, the darker the color, the bigger the number of measures. You will see that in Sub-Saharan Africa, most of the measures happen between end of March and April and continue until partially August of 2020. But after that, there has been some relaxation of those measures, which could be problematic, but also could be, if done properly, it could be a way forward, given that you don't want to affect more the GDP growth of the country and, of course, informal activities, which are so important in Sub-Saharan Africa. But again, this number of measures that were put between end of March and August also had a consequence. And the typical analysis that we look at is the perfect correlation, negative correlation between the containment policies being put in place by governments and the potential negative effects it has on economic growth. And that's basically what explains the huge decline on GDP growth in 2020 and 2021. Why? Because the pandemic is not a normal recession, it's not a financial crisis, it's an induced crisis, an induced recession, which has an exogenous health shock. But these containment measures are the ones that create this negative effect. So again, the containment measures were needed to be able to reduce the epi curves, but we need to figure out a way in which we can do containment through vaccination without affecting GDP growth, because that will create a significant effect over economies which require of this growth to be able to keep moving forward. But with the situation of huge low levels of vaccination in the continent, we face a significant challenge. Now, this is clearly reflected in what we see as the drop in real income. And this is the dashed lines indicate the pre-crisis projection for Sub-Saharan Africa. is an index in real terms, and the solid lines is what we project, what is projected to be the growth after the COVID-19. If you look at advanced economies, as I mentioned before in the top graph, the blue one, clearly there is a recovery even higher than what was projected before COVID-19. But in the case of Sub-Saharan Africa, the measures that are in place are not getting the results that we would like. On the contrary, the recovery is very slow. And this slow recovery has also a problem on exacerbation of inequalities. These stringent measures also has exacerbated inequalities. If you look at the graph on the right-hand side, the vertical bars in red shows worsening inequalities. Only very few cases will see an improvement in inequality. So these worsening inequalities within the continent, but also across the world, but especially in the case of the continent in question, tell us one enormous problem that we face, which is the exacerbation of inequalities as a result of COVID-19, which again exacerbates even more the potential capacity of the continent to recover. Now, let me move to the numbers in terms of undernourishment, people in Africa. And after a long trend of decreasing prevalence and relative unchanging number of undernourished people, both began to rise in Africa in 2014. And the new estimates show that the sharpest increase in undernourishment ever observed in a single year from 2019 to 2020. For the continent, and this is compared with 2019, 46 million more people in Africa were affected by hunger in 2020. So significant increase of chronic undernourishment in the case of Africa, which is again changing a trend that was looking a little bit better, but this single year has created a significant effect. Not only that, when we look at across the different subregions, the estimates show, as is shown in the graph, that enduring and troubling regional inequalities. The proportion of the population in Northern Africa affected by hunger in 2020, 7.1%, is much smaller compared with almost all the subregions of Africa south of the Sub-Saharan, except for South Africa, which is 10.1%. In the other subregions, the prevalence ranges from 18.7% in Western Africa to 31.8% in Middle Africa. And the largest number of undernourished people, more than 125 million, live in Eastern Africa. The prevalence of undernourishment increased from 2019 to 2020 in all the subregions in Africa, and the sharpest increase of 5.8 percentage points in just 1 year was in Western Africa, corresponding to 24.6 million more people undernourished. We also did an effort to project the situation faced in this continent. And the projections for the number of undernourished globally at the regional level confirm the enormous challenge of eradicating hunger by 2030. However, the evolution from 2020 to 2030 in terms of numbers of undernourished people is quite different across regions. A significant increase is forecast for Africa, where the number is projected to reach 300 million people, placing it on par with Asia by 2030, as it can be seen in the graph. So what we observe is the red line, and the dotted line, which is the projection, converges with what we have observed before in Asia, which was the one with the highest level of chronic undernourishment. So Africa is projected to be the region with the highest number of undernourished people, even in the absence of COVID-19 pandemic. So the thick dots is with COVID-19 pandemic, and the dots is without COVID-19 pandemic. Now, what happens with the other indicators of nutrition that we look at, which is child stunting, child overweight, child wasting, and anemia in women of reproductive age, and also adult obesity. And here we're talking about SDG target 2.2 and the World Health Assembly commitments, targets that were done. And estimates here that I am showing regarding malnutrition in 2030 are characterized by a greater level of uncertainty this year than in the past, as with projections for hunger. So the estimates of the progress toward these targets presented in this table not account for the effect of COVID-19 pandemic. If we take into account COVID-19 pandemic, there are a series of academic papers that has been produced. The situation is even worse. But without taking even into account the COVID pandemic, we don't give positive results. And basically, as you can see in most of the orange and red, we are not on track. So Africa as a whole is off track for all 4 SDG 2.2 nutrition targets: stunting, wasting, and overweight among children under 5, and anemia in women of reproductive age. All sub-regions have shown progress towards the stunting target since 2012, but not enough to achieve the 2030 target. For child wasting and overweight and anemia in women, most sub-regions are making no progress. All sub-regions are off track to meet the 2025 WHO World Health Assembly target to halt the rise of adult obesity by 2025. So we have a multiple dimensional problem, not only of undernutrition, but also a problem of overnutrition that we need to take care. Now, this is just new numbers that are coming out from the 2021 Food Insecurity Experience Scale, and some countries to look in Sub-Saharan Africa, where you clearly see still an increase in moderate and severe food insecurity, which basically incorporates both undernourishment and overnourishment, and with severe food insecurity, which is mostly related to our chronic undernourishment number, which again see that the situation is worsening. When the color is present, when the red color is present, means that the result is statistically significant. When it's gray, means that we don't have a statistical significance. So the situation in terms of food security and nutrition is not good, is off track, and has got through the worst year in the last 10 or 15 years in terms of increase and deterioration of the different indicators of nutrition. Now, what happens in terms of trade, which is so important for Africa, because if we take a picture today of Africa and we look at the 9 food groups that are required to be able to comply with access to healthy diets, a significant proportion, more than 70% of the countries don't have access to all of those 9 food groups. So while the World Food Trade Organization estimated a 9.2% contraction of world merchandise trade due to COVID-19 impacts, global trade in agriculture and food products was only marginally affected. Particularly for food products for which demand is inelastic, trade continued to occur despite the lockdowns, and much of the global trade in non-perishable staples is characterized by bulk shipments and automated processes. However, some disruptions in the agricultural and food trade were observed at the very beginning of the global movement restrictions, which was the first few months of the lockdown process. But African countries for which early data were available reported sizable declines in agricultural exports and imports in the early months of the pandemic, and COVID-19 containment measures of African countries and of their trading partners worldwide affected agricultural and food trade. Countries in Africa started imposing strict lockdown measures at the end of March, as I mentioned before, and the most stringent measures were phased out by July, as it was previously mentioned. But none of the countries considered in this analysis had returned to full normality by the end of 2020. Restrictions on movements of people followed similar patterns in many countries, notably developed countries, which are among Africa's main trading partners. And concerns over trade and value chain disruptions at the beginning of the pandemic led many countries to impose policy measures to limit potentially adverse impacts of food security and food safety. Several African countries applied measures such as temporary export restrictions, relaxation of import barriers on a specific or all food to increase or stabilize domestic supply, measures to facilitate trade procedures, and temporary import restrictions or traditional certification requirements in response to fears of a possible COVID-19 transmission through the importation of food products, and this was specifically the case for meat. Measures to provide more targeted support to farmers and consumers included input subsidies, the expansion of release of food stocks, and the implementation of expansion of price control mechanisms. And the table that I am showing here presents a list of the countries applying this type of measures. But what happens in terms of the numbers between imports and exports? And this graph shows the percentage change in agricultural and food export and import values in Africa, but comparing January to December 2020 to the same month on average in 2018 and 2019, so that we can see pre-COVID-19 and post-COVID-19. So in April and May 2020, when most countries in the world had imposed strict lockdown measures, agriculture and food export values of the aggregate of 14 African countries fell compared with the average of the same months in 2018 and 2019. Similar to the global level patterns, this decline was followed by a rebound, as you can see the positive bars, rebound effect in June. And in the second half of 2020, agriculture and food exports of the African countries tended to be higher in value terms than the average 2018 to 2019. The development of import values in 2020 was relatively more volatile, as you can see in the graphs in the red bars in the right-hand side. Import values of the aggregate of the African countries considered in the analysis had dropped already in February. By May 2020, they were down 15% compared with average values in the previous 2 years. Imports show strong rebound effects in June, but decline again in July 20. On average, import values remain above pandemic levels in the second half of 2020. Now, in addition to changes in the prices and in volumes of trade with partners, part of the effect of COVID-19 pandemic and related containment measures on trade in agricultural and food products was induced by complete disruptions of trade flows. In fact, the number of export flows or export links of specific goods between two specific trading partners had shrunk by 25% already in April 2020 compared with the same month in 2018 and 2019, as you can clearly see in the figure. That number was still down by more than 20% in May 2020 and remained subdued through June and July. The number of export flows did not deviate much from the pre-COVID average between August and November, but increased by around 7 percentage points in December 2020. The number of import flows for the African countries considered in the analysis declined by more than 10% in April and slightly less than 10% in May 2020 relative to the average number of import flows in 2018 and 2019. In July 2020, it was again more than 10% lower, while relatively little variation was observed between August and October. More important, flows than the average of previous years were recorded in November and December of 2020. Moreover, the number of interregional import flows, so interregional import flows of countries in Africa south of the Sub-Saharan show a relative sharper decline than import flows from other regions in the first phase of the pandemic and related containment measures. The relative resilience of extra African imports might reflect the global orientation of African trade. Much of Africa trade and transport infrastructure is adapted to facilitate external trade. In addition, although official statistics do not capture informal trade, available data suggests that informal intra-African trade also declined sharply in early 2020 compared to the previous years. Now, if we look at the composition by commodity, African exports vary, as you can see in the graph here, where we are looking at the percentage change in the number of export links of agricultural food products. And you will see that some of the commodities like tobacco, like flowers, like live animals have a significant shock, and some of them are recovering. So we need to take into account also the differences among the commodities. And let me just finalize, share by saying, okay, where we need to move. And here is where we are saying the best way to move forward is to increase resilience of the food systems. And that requires two elements: minimize risks, vulnerabilities, and coping with risk when they occur capabilities. To minimize risks, we need to focus on increased investment in early warning systems. And I think we can move very fast in Sub-Saharan Africa to have those early warning systems in place. And we at FAO are more than happy to keep supporting on this. The second element is the One Health approach, as promoted by FAO, OIE, and WHO, plus UNEP, which has enormous potential to prevent the emergence of new zoonotic reservoirs from the current COVID-19. And finally, we need to work intensively in improving our agricultural insurance and how we can use index-based combined with traditional index insurance or traditional insurance to increase access and therefore make farmers and smallholders especially more resilient. But to cope, we need to find other elements which are more of medium and long term. First, focus on social protection mechanisms to support access to food for the poor and food which is nutritious. But also, we need to find ways of targeting better the interventions. We need to align incentives and redirect subsidies. We just produced a report on repurposing of subsidies where we see the amount of distortions that these are created. So we need to find ways to realign them. And we need to keep improving on trade to boost farmer productivity, intra-regional trade especially, by improving and increasing food safety so that we can increase also traceability and allow goods to move with less non-tariff barriers. We need to link to infrastructure initiative, which has been decelerated, and we need to accelerate again the process of infrastructure, especially value chain infrastructure, and also link to financial systems. And finally, we need to use technology wisely, supporting investment in digital innovations in food and agriculture, which has shown to be a significant tool to improve interregional trade, improve trade, and to accelerate the process of recovery. So let me stop there, and thank you again for the time. Thank you. Back to you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Dr. Torero. We, the entire global community, so depend upon the expertise of the FAO. And your personal commitment to these issues is one that the community of the food systems around the globe, but particularly here in Sub-Saharan Africa, so much appreciate. Thank you for participating in today's conference and bringing us that data. To all the participants, as you saw in the chat box, please, if you have questions or comments, write them and include them into the chat box. Our next speaker is Dr. Elian Ubelejoro. He is the Executive Director of Sustainability in the Digital Age Global Hub Director of Canada Future Earth and co-editor of the 2021 Annual Trends and Outlook Report, the ATOR. He will provide us with an overview of the 2021 Annual Trends and Outlook Report. Thank you very much, Dr. Elan, for your comments. Please, the floor is yours, madam.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Let me start by sharing my screen. Okay, great. So it's a real pleasure for me to be here today, and I would like to thank my co-editors for the amazing work that was done, and really appreciate the opportunity to be here with all of you today and present the OTAR 2021. So this overview has several parts that we're going to go through, and Maximo did an excellent job of talking about COVID-19 and how COVID-19 has disproportionately affected, in terms of vaccination rates, Africa, and how the need for accelerated vaccination needs to be something that needs to be prioritized. So I'm going to go over quickly and just tell you about the overall context in terms of OTAR 2021 is really this idea that across the globe, the priorities have to be looked at in terms of how are we looking at the health crisis and economic damage to ensure that the global economy that is facing the greatest recession since the last financial crisis of 2008-09, and how is this affecting Africa? So what we know, we've talked about, Maximo has already talked about the decline and looking at how this is disproportionately affecting Africa in terms of the recovery. And we also know that it's really critical that recovery allows Africa to become more resilient and capable of withstanding challenges posed by not only climate, health, political, economic, and all other shocks. So this edition of OTAR has focused on food and nutrition security as well as the stresses of COVID-19. And what we know is that concern is growing that the direct and indirect effects of the pandemic will be greater in Africa than the rest of the world. And as a result, it's really critical that we think about how do we strengthen institutions and health capacity and ensure that the numbers projection in terms of the large amount of poor and vulnerable people, that we really think about how this greater exposure to world trade cycle and high dependency on demand from advanced economies, and ensure that the vulnerability to climate change impacts is contained, especially for the most marginalized and informal economy market traders who were initially most affected. In terms of the policy responses to COVID-19, overall, Maxim also showed that the response was quick. However, these actions had effects on economic trade. And in Gentilini and colleagues find that nearly all African countries scaled up social protection programs in response to the crisis. However, coverage remains lower in Africa than in other parts of the world. But it is important to note that coverage in sub-Saharan Africa did increase by 3% compared to pre-pandemic levels. So in terms of how this report builds on the Malabo Declaration, it's really important to reemphasize this idea of let's recommit to the principles and values of CADP and to enhance investments in finance and agriculture. How do we look at hunger by 2025, given the alarming numbers that Maximo shared, and have poverty through 2025? And this will require boosting intra-African trade in agriculture and commodities, enhancing resilience to climate, but also strengthening mutual accountability for action and results. So what COVID-19 demonstrated, it's really the need to extend commitment on resilience beyond climate and look at what is happening in terms of present and future climate variables in shorts. And efforts should also include focus on other risks and shocks. And we know that we have to look at what is needed for the short, medium, and long-term impacts and pay specific attention to what are those specific needs. So focusing on food systems value chains as well as ecosystem service will be really critical to build resilience to shocks. And how we pay attention to macro and micro level can reveal the discrepancies in who is most vulnerable based on socioeconomic disparities. So UTARD 2021 really covers the assessment of the impact of COVID-19 on African economies, with specific focus on food systems from access to inputs to household consumption. We reviewed the policy interventions to stop the spread of the pandemic and contain its negative impact on food systems across the continent, and highlighted innovations in measurement needed to better understand the effects of the pandemic and the factors contributing to resilience. And of course, we also finished off by tracking of progress towards CADP. So what's really critical to understand, and I think this was also highlighted in the previous keynote, is really the accelerated number of hungry and the expected increase of food insecurity. And so we've talked about the price behavior of staples and how that has affected the vulnerability of African countries. And we also talked about negative impacts were lower in countries with more diversified export baskets. So this underlines the need for countries to diversify trade to remain resilient to global shocks. And among the different food systems components, we know that food processing industries were by far the most vulnerable to negative impacts of the pandemic, as the demands for their products are very sensitive to declines in income. And also levels of vulnerability really differed markedly as well within countries, underlying the need for decision makers to monitor local effects closely and be prepared to intervene in areas with high levels of vulnerability. So assessing the African economic policy responses against COVID-19 shows that really there's a lot of complexity in this space, and we need further research. And this research is really critical to further innovate and integrate digital data to accelerate capacity for effective emergency response. And we also know that the delivery of social protection programs to combat COVID-19 in Africa require increased resources, especially to support the most vulnerable. And how we rethink the role of social protection in African food systems post-COVID will be very critical to rural and urban households that saw a significant decline in income during the pandemics. In terms of the measurement issues, we know that we talked about USAID earlier talked about the importance of data. And so what we know is that remote sensing and machine learning for food crop production in Africa will be required to be accelerated. And this really needs to be harnessed to ensure that we have high quality data that can be used to enhance resilience. And in terms of measurement approaches, we know that health systems sensitive to resilience index are critical to ensure agile responses to global health shocks. The measurement of resilience capacities through integration of macro level and micro level indicators show that the strong health systems protect against food insecurity. And so it's really critical that ministries of health and agriculture have stronger and stronger cooperations. And in terms of the methods of assessment of the impact of COVID-19 on community dietary patterns, what we also revealed is how critical behavioral change communication strategies can be. And given the data that Maximo shared around the alarming indices around nutrition, it's really critical that we look at these methods of assessment to really ensure that behavioral change happens. And what we also talk about in UTARD 2021 is really the need for consumer-focused food security nexus that frames the needs to drive assessments of value chain performance. In terms of the progress towards CADP, what we know is that a lot of work has effectively been put in place before COVID-19, and this needs to be accelerated. And so policies are needed to promote cross-border trade, to ensure consumers access food and producers access to inputs as well as broader markets. We also know that initiatives to improve the quality and completeness of trade data, including informal trade in order to allow countries to better monitor the effects of prices on trade, are really important. And one positive element we need to look at is how can we harness the African Continental Free Trade Agreement to ensure that its implementation accelerates and to ensure potential benefits in terms of increased incomes and food security will contribute to Africa's recovery from the effects of the pandemic. overall, it's really critical that we focus on the most vulnerable to ensure that nobody is left behind and ensure that the numbers in terms of half the continent's population that are facing either moderate or severe food insecurity are really addressed. And how do we ensure that trade allows us to address these? In terms of the strategic responses of African countries, Maximo has talked about how those policies really were put in place to contain COVID-19, but it's more and more important that how this response also induced shocks, and that we need programs that ensure that not only are we looking at facing the pandemic crisis, but also ensuring that a flow of goods really ensures that we continue to put in place social protection mechanisms and allow safety nets that improve the integration of these programs overall for development frameworks. In terms of the measurement issues, we know that access to accurate and timely food production data is paramount. We know that it provides information that can be used to better prepare countries to respond to shocks. And nonetheless, what we know is that human capital finances and other limitations are really critical in terms of how we interact with them to ensure that sustainable collection of accurate and timely data remains something that doesn't stay a challenge in African countries, but actually becomes a way of allowing greater resilience, to align food systems resilience to climate change mitigation and adaptation, especially as we know that we want to align this work with the decade of ecosystem restoration. And so how we look at climate change and COVID-19 is really critical at that interface of One Health that Maxim also shared earlier. And so that those interlinkages at the micro and macro level really require a middle ground where health and agriculture are tightly interlinked in ways that ensure that shocks in one don't accelerate shocks in the other. And so strengthening both together is really critical. And so these disruptions to food systems, we know that negatively affected the availability and access to nutritious food, and that we need to counter measures to ensure that diets and health risks are mitigated. And so adequate measurements of dietary patterns are needed to monitor and manage changes in population's dietary behavior. So in terms of the progress toward CAADP goals, in 2021, Africa recorded an economic recession for the first time in more than 2 decades. And the continent's GDP per capita regressed to the level recorded a decade ago. So millions of jobs have been lost as a result of the pandemic. And this significant reduction in household income, interruption of services, and fluctuations in the availability and affordability of healthy diets played a notable role in generating similar negative trends for nutrition. So after increasing in recent years, the prevalence of undernourishment further expanded in 2020. So what we know is that we need to get back to the meaningful progress that was made prior to 2020 and reduce child malnutrition. And it's really critical that the lessons learned that are shared from OTAR 2021 can really help continue the progress that was made prior to the pandemic to allow us to really build forward stronger. And in conclusion, what we really share is it's really urgent that evidence-based strategies that ensure stable food and nutrition security are present, and that they support economic growth across the continent in ways that will include the 3 following things. So we know we need to enhance social protection mechanisms. We know we need to ensure the functioning of markets. And we also know that we need to develop a more comprehensive indicator framework that needs to be aided by the deployment of new measurement methodologies that link health to food systems and the adoption of more ecologically viable agricultural production systems. And we know that investing in the social protection programs, understanding these market dynamics, and developing a more comprehensive data strategy are really important first steps for further actions that should be taken. So just want to thank everybody and really appreciate the opportunity to share with you this overview of OTAR 2021. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those very enlightening and thoughtful comments, Doctor. Your presentation has given us the challenge, has presented to us the challenges that COVID has wreaked upon the continent, but also a very clear way forward. We know, and as you noted in your comments, that what is necessary for both the continent as well as the global community to overcome the challenges that COVID wrought upon the continent and the people of the continent during 2020. The questions of how we move forward as we move through this discussion today, we will begin to answer. So very much appreciate your contribution here today. And on behalf of the organizers, thank you again for your presentation. It is now time for us to turn to our plenary discussion, which will be moderated by Professor Cheryl Hendricks, the Department Head of Agricultural Economics, Extension, and Rural Development for the University of Pretoria. She will be joined by distinguished panelists, including Dr. Ismahan El-Wafi, the Chief Scientist at the FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization, Dr. Godfrey Bahigwa, the Director of the Department of Agriculture of Rural Development, the Blue Economy and Sustainable Environment at the African Union Commission, Dr. Martin Ferjani, the Director for Agriculture and Agro-Industry at the African Development Bank, and Mr. Benito Eliassi, the Program Officer for the Southern African Confederation of Agricultural Unions. It is my pleasure now to turn over to Professor Cheryl Hendricks to moderate this distinguished panel.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Ambassador Cousin, for the warm welcome, and acknowledge Ambassador Sak, who's present, as well as Dr. Usman Badian, the Executive Chairperson of Academia 2063. Welcome to the panelists in this session, and thank you for the opportunity to get down to some practical explanations and ideas around how we're going to deal with resilience and around food systems in Africa as we go forward. So can I start off with Ismahane? Good afternoon or good morning. Ismahane, you're part of the scientific group of the UN Food Systems Summit. So I know from firsthand experience that you have been at the heart of looking at resilience in food systems and the impact of COVID. Can you elaborate a little bit about what COVID-19 has taught us about the resilience of food systems in Africa and how we respond to these shocks?
Thank you very much, Cheryl. It's really a pleasure to join the RESAC's colleagues here today. So I think really COVID-19 has amplified the good and the bad in many ways across the world. And for Africa, particularly, Africa agri-food system is defined by vulnerability to multiple and overlapping shocks. So this is one of the really notable feature of Africa food system is that it has been dealing with multiple and overlapping shocks and threats, and those mostly are climate-related shocks, transboundary pests and diseases. We saw just in the recent history, both the desert locust, but also the form armyworm and many more. We have a huge number of conflicts, and we have also economic downturns and economic slowdown. If we look at the prevalence of the undernourishment, it has increased quite a lot. So when I know Maximo and Eliane have given quite an extensive analysis, but if we look just at the index per se, it was about 21.2% in 2015. It went up to 22% in 2019, and now we are at 24.1. So definitely COVID-19 pandemic has further compounded the problems and the vulnerability in the agri-food system in Africa. What is really bad is that by 2030, Africa is forecast to have half of the global total undernourished people. So from this 24%, we're going to go up to about 50%. The agri-food system in Africa features a lot of inefficiencies that are caused by structural deficits. The source of agriculture growth in Africa has largely been through expansion of cultivated area at expenses of forest and grassland. We have seen very little improvement and increase in productivity. So the yield gap is still very high. A recent study by FAO on the land use change between 2000 and 2018 showed that we have 12 million hectares of forests that were cleared and converted to cropland. Whereas when we look at areas where science and innovation could help a lot, we find out that water use efficiency has been the lowest compared to the other region, showing only very marginal improvement over time. In addition, there are significant leakages along the agri-food value chain. So the value chain, it's not mature at the continent per se. The post-harvest losses, it's still very high. It's about 14%. And it's one of the largest against a backdrop of a low production level overall. So the system is very vulnerable. There is multiple threats, and there is a need really to look at the system level and fix it at the system level. Over to you, Cheryl.
Sure. Thank you so much. Godfrey, we know that CAADP is one of the agents of change at the systemic level, and we know that you've been involved in CAADP at various different levels over the years. We also know that the Malabo 2014 declaration included a commitment for enhancing resilience in livelihoods and food systems, and a very thoughtful July 2020 discussion amongst heads of states at the beginning of the pandemic also elaborated and strengthened this commitment. But can you give us a perspective of how countries in Africa have responded to the problems that Ismahane has set out? So what happened in terms of policies and actions amongst African countries? Thanks, Godfrey.
Yeah, thank you so much, Cheryl. As you have stated, enhancing resilience to climate variability is one of the 7 CAADP Malabo commitments. And the African Union Commission, together with ODA, NEPAD, and regional economic communities, have been tracking the progress that our member states are making in building resilience. And we produce a report every 2 years, starting 2017, and the second report of 2019. In just next month, we'll be releasing the third report of the CAADP annual review process. I do have the findings, but I will not share them in this platform. You just have to attend our meeting next month. But having said that, in the 2019 report, we saw improved commitment of our member states to building resilience. And in the report that we produce, we have two key indicators for looking at resilience. One is the share of agricultural land under sustainable land management practices. And the second indicator is existence of government-specific budget lines that to which they allocate resources for building resilience. So from the AU perspective, those are the two indicators that we track and on which we can speak given the findings in our report. And so between the 2 years, 2017 and 2019, we saw a positive progress. In other words, increasing numbers of countries that are caring for land, and also increased number of countries that are dedicating specific budget lines to building resilience. So that is something positive. So we are looking forward to the findings of the next report next month to see what progress member states have made. But we believe we should see perhaps more positive results because of the impact of COVID, where member states were forced to intervene in responding to COVID-19. Now, as you heard both Maximo and Eliane speaking, I will not get into the details of the response measures that our member states took in responding to COVID-19. Suffice to say that we saw basically two aspects. Those about saving lives, and we saw increased expenditures in food aid, in cash transfers, and so on. And within the agriculture sector, we saw increased support to farmers, especially with the provision of agriculture inputs, seed, fertilizers, and so on. The second category are the more or less long-term measures that we expect countries to take to be able to build back better in the coming years. Now, in the third biannual review report that I mentioned will be coming up next month, we expect new data that will shed light on the further progress that countries are making in terms of building resilience. However, what we are observing is more and more countries are spending more money in the two areas that I mentioned before. That is in land management, more land under sustainable land management practices, and also dedicating more budget lines. Like I said, I'm not going to give details because next month we shall release the report to
going to keep it under wraps so that you keep us tuned in.
Yes.
Thank you so much. So, but obviously the benefit
of
having a comprehensive national plan is something that really does help with the response and being able to respond. But one of the questions that you raise is, how do governments finance these plans and ideas, particularly in areas like scaling up social protection? Martin, the finance sector was not spared and was one of the elements turned to by national governments in the COVID crisis. Can you give us a little bit of insight as to how financial institutions, particularly the African Development Bank, responded to COVID and the cries of countries, and what is the bank doing in order to buffer the countries in the wake of COVID? Over to you, Martin. Sorry, you're on mute.
Thank you very much, Professor Cheryl Hendricks, and I want to thank Rescas for inviting the bank to participate in this very important meeting, and congratulations also on the annual Trends and Outlook report. With respect to COVID, I will just talk very quickly about what the bank did, but I will emphasize more on what the bank is planning to do in collaboration with IFAD to ensure that African countries can build resilience. In response to COVID-19, the African Development Bank and our strategy of Feed Africa actually quickly restructured $367 million out of the total portfolio of $4.2 billion that we have in agriculture to address specific issues faced by the sector in 21 regional member countries. We had short-term, we had immediate, short-term, and medium-term interventions, all the way from providing resources to purchase food or to provide inputs to farmers, to more medium terms of building, resilience infrastructure, particularly in the Sahel, things like water for cattle and things like that. We also had a budget support as part of the bank's overall response to COVID-19, and we had about $1.2 billion that had food security components in that budget support. But I'd like to talk about the comprehensive financing that the bank is pursuing with IFAD, to face such pandemics like COVID-19 and other shocks to the system. We find ourselves at a unique point in history. You just had Dr. Bahigwa talked about 2 decades of action on CADA. We have learned a lot and also things that we can build on for the future. But at the same time, the future is more unpredictable. We've just seen the shocks of COVID-19 pandemic and also the extreme weather from global warming, and now we just heard from COP26 that if we don't get to zero emissions in the next 20 or 30 years, we can expect more of this, extreme weather. Also this year, the UN Food System Summit, happened, COP26, committing to actions. So we've had we're starting at a very unique point when it is a convergence of experience from the past and also the convergence of actions to actually get agriculture in Africa back on a stronger footing. Earlier this year, April 29, 17 heads of states gathered and actually asked the bank and IFA that were co-hosting that high-level dialogue to actually set up a financing facility to address, the need to deliver technologies at scale to modernize African agriculture, and also the need to address fragility. There are like 20 countries in Africa that can be considered as fragile, and we all know that capacity in those countries are really difficult. So there's also the private sector investment to leverage private sector investment and climate-proof African agriculture. So in response to the request of the heads of state, IFAD and the African Development Bank are designing a new facility that will call the Financing Facility for Food and Nutrition. The facility aims to do 5 things, to distribute technologies at scale so that Africa can double its production and increase food production. And second is to build resilience into the food systems, and I'll talk about that in a short while. And then lastly, to support fragile states that are often perceived too risky, through leveraging and private sector investments in those states. We expect to raise $1 billion in the next 2 years, and then work with countries to provide them concessionary loans, and also provide a window for technical assistance in fragile states, and then thirdly to provide loan guarantees to the private sector. And we intend to reach 40 million farmers, as I said before, and in so doing, double their productivity and produce an additional 100 million tons of food.
Right.
We hope that this will indeed feed about 200 million hungry Africans, and then at least help the continent become more resilient to shocks. Thank you. Well, back to you, Professor Hendricks.
Great, thank you. So you've really stepped up to meet the challenge in this very challenging context. Let's move to hearing from Benito. What is the situation on the ground? How have smallholders in your region experienced COVID?
Thank you, Sharon, and thank you everyone for inviting Sakao to be in this panel. The first and foremost thing that I wanted to mention is the issue of the importance of information in terms of any resilient programs. I'm saying this because what we discovered is that during the pandemic itself, the information that was going to farmers, instead of assisting farmers to be certain and to be calm during that period, it caused a lot of panic to farmers. And that panic resulted into them making irrational decisions. So in the future, the support that we need to put in place, let us consider how we package information and how it is delivered to farmers, considering the role of social media. So that's the message I want to leave. If you forget anything, just remember that. But in terms of the actual impact, I want to agree with what Maximo said, that the impact necessarily was not caused by the pandemic or the disease itself, but the containment measures that were put in place to contain the disease. And this mainly affected the markets of produce and markets of inputs for farmers. And we have examples in countries such as Zimbabwe, because the market, for example, flour in Dutch collapsed. Most farmers who were growing flowers, they also didn't access that market. As a result, they lost a lot of input. Likewise, closure of borders in Tanzania, for example, affected the exports of horticultural crops. And countries like Seychelles, Lesotho, Eswatini, and Tanzania itself, countries where farmers depend much on facilities, tourism facilities. The closure of these facilities resulted into farmers not having a market for their produce. And most of the produce that are sold in these facilities are perishables. So the post-harvest loss of most of the perishables, especially vegetables and horticultural
highly
crops.
nutritious crops.
Yes, they are nutritious, and it affected a lot. Now, what we learned most, and this is another message, is the fact that one-size-fits-all solutions does not work, because the pandemic affected farmers in different ways. So they needed differentiated support, differentiated products for them to come out of the pandemic and to rebuild. The second thing maybe that I conclude with is the issue in terms of the support that the government gave. I've heard Dr. Baingwa talking about the support. But in the sector itself, we found that the support was provided by only declaring that farming or agriculture and food sector is one of the essential services. But there was no specific products or specific support that were given to farmers, especially smallholder farmers, and that left them without any assistance. So we require to have measures in preparation for future pandemics, that if we could have resources that could be accessed by farmers, especially smaller farmers, in such pandemics, for them to recover as well as rebuild, that could help. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Benito. You certainly took your opportunity to put some ideas on the table, and at risk of putting you, Ismahana, in the trap of one size fits all, having heard Benito's input, what would you think is really needed in terms of policy in Africa taking us forward to build greater resilience of food systems?
Thank you, Cheryl. I think that the way the discussion is going, it's quite interesting. So I think you saw the paper I co-authored with my colleague from the Scientific Committee of the UN Food Systems Summit, Tom Hurtle, Frank, and Morakot, on really the need to look at diversification across the food system. And the idea is really that Africa needs really to adopt a multi-sectorial, multi-stakeholder approach, which guide innovative investment solutions for sustainable and resilient food systems. So we need to look at, as I said, the value chain is not mature. We need really to develop it. And by developing it, we need really to keep the diversity as really the key component. So not only looking at bridging the gap of productivity, which is doable by moving towards more innovative approaches and more modernization of the agriculture sector through irrigation, through improvement of seed, to improvement of feed, to many other ways, but also looking at it at the systemic level and look at the cross-fertilization between the different sectors. And I think if there is one thing that we have gained from the UN Food Systems Summit is that the system level approach, it's acceptable. We brought the attention to other ministries that we might not have been talking to, like the infrastructure ministry, the health ministry, the nutrition component, the transport, and so on and so forth. So I would say more specifically, what Africa needs to do to address issues related to access to resources and opportunities to rural producers, and particularly to disadvantaged social groups. So we have to have very much rethinking and a different way of doing it when we talk about accessibility to resources, particularly for women and youth. We have to address the infrastructure deficit in its both soft and hard aspects. So both the digital agriculture, but also the roads, the storage, the processing, the transportation, the logistic, the skills of people. We need also to address the issues of incentives to invest by relevant actors across the agri-food system again, bringing value to the farmer, to the rural producers, to the consumers, to the investors, such as factoring in consumers as significant stakeholder, or we're talking about healthy and nutrition diet. And we need also to address the structural vulnerabilities through well-designed and implemented mechanisms to strengthen the resilience. And it goes back to really have an effective multi-sectorial approaches and engagement of partners and multi-stakeholders, but also maybe use the power of Africa, which is its youth, its people, youth that are eager to work, that are eager to innovate, that are eager to participate, bring them with providing them an environment whereby SMEs could be developed in such a beautiful way in Africa. So youth can make that food system more mature in Africa. And of course, the intra-trade is very important as well. Over to you. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you. Certainly not a one size fits all. Thank you very much.
Absolutely not a one size fits all. And that's really what came in the paper. It's context specific, Cheryl. Yeah.
Yes. Great. Maybe you could share the link to the paper in the chat. Godfrey.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Godfrey, so we know that CAADP has already put in place these comprehensive plans. And we know that CAADP has changed the narrative on development in Africa and set the pace for many countries, for example, through the GAPS funds and processes that were modeled on CAADP in the past. We also know that the Common African Position on the SDGs had a significant influence on the SDG process and M&E for the SDGs. Can you shed some light on what you predict the Common African Position on the UN Food System Summit is likely to have on the future actions in Africa and resilience?
Thank you, Cheryl. Yes, as you have pointed out, the African Union Commission worked with the ODA, NEPAD, and technical institutions on the continent, including Academia 2063, to put together a common position that was presented at the UN Food System Summit in September. The common position followed the structure of the UN Food System Summit along the 5 action tracks, and one of them is about building resilience, which for us is in line with the commitment number 6 within the CAADP Malabo Declaration. Now, in the Africa Common Position, we had 43 game-changing proposals or solutions, and 6 of these are dedicated directly towards building resilience. And I can see a lot of them are actually reflected in the current article that was presented earlier. And Dr. Ismahan has also highlighted some of them. So one is designing targeted social safety net programs, especially for vulnerable groups. Mention was made about the need for credible data. So the call is for investment in climate data and knowledge for the establishment of early warning systems for food security and climate related disasters. Third is investment in partnerships to overcome water scarcity on the continent, which is a constraint for many rural producers. Fourth is the establishment of national and regional food reserves. Fifth is the improvement of services to smallholder farmers, and Dr. Ismail has just mentioned some of them: skills development, and we can add improved advisory services to farmers and so on. Sixth is investment in risk insurance, especially weather indexed crop and livestock insurance. And here the Africa Risk Capacity Initiative of the African Union comes in handy with development of those programs. And finally, another action is the promotion of traditional and indigenous African food crops that are already resilient to climate change, but are also nutritious at the same time. So in terms of action, what is required is the domestication of these commitments into national action plans and encouraging our governments to allocate resources for their implementation. Second is resource mobilization. As you know, the COVID-19 impacted our economies, as you saw the presentation by Maximo, reduced economic growth, which also led to reduced fiscal space, reduced government revenue. So we need to mobilize more resources to support investments. And actually, the Africa Common Position specifically called for the Africa Development Bank to develop a special fund that member states can access in order to respond and build back better. And finally, we need to track and report progress in building resilience on the continent. And the biennial review, the CADA biennial review process is one such, including review of the indicators to make sure that we have more robust indicators that can measure resilience much stronger than we currently have it in the process.
Great, sure. Thank you. Martin, you've heard the challenge. What beyond financing is the bank going to do to help, particularly with recurrent shocks?
Thank you very much, Professor Cheryl. I think I'll just quickly list them, 7 of them very quickly. The first one is stabilization of food prices through targeted releases from food reserves. We saw during the pandemic that many of the food reserves were actually severely depleted, and this led to very sharp increases in prices. So we're actually providing resources to countries to actually replenish its food, just to buy and store this food, rebuild its food reserves. The second one is digital advisory systems. As you heard from Dr. Eliane and also from other speakers, also from Dr. Maximo Torero, we need better ways to predict both rainfall and droughts and pests and famine. And we're really investing in this. We have a big project in the Horn of Africa that actually is going to be doing these digital advisory systems, both for herders and farmers. The third is building resilience by providing climate adapted, heat tolerant wheat, drought tolerant maize at scale to farmers. And of course, crop insurance, a very, very important part of building resilience, as you heard Dr. Bahigwa say. And then the fourth is processing of food into very highly nutritious, stable products that can be stored for a very long time. I know many people have said that the post-harvest losses were greater, with vegetables, but we do have foods that can be fed to children that can easily be stored for a very long time. And we're really investing in this, working with game. The sixth is policies to actually enhance the free flow of food and inputs, particularly when movements are disrupted. We saw how movement disruption led to a sharp increase in prices. We have to be able to create green channels, and this is part of the bank's budget support. And also, the last actually is operation food security task forces. Here we're working with the AUC, to mobilize $5 million from the special emergency assistance fund, to help countries. Africa actually has 16 of the 20 countries that the FAO and World Food Program say are at the highest risk to food. So we're trying to help them with seeds and things to be able to at least produce a crop to reduce some of the impacts of famine in those countries. Thank you, Cheryl. Back to you.
Great, thank you, Benita. You've heard the planned ideas. Can you give us one example in the 2 minutes left of this panel discussion? What is the most effective form of support that your farmers have received through COVID? I hope you're not going to say they received nothing. What was the most effective support your farmers have received?
Yeah, thank you. Indeed, some farmers, and I have to differentiate from country to country. Mm-hmm. Farmers who received support in the region, and this information comes from our members, is farmers in Namibia and South Africa. And this was basically a support that was given to them to restart or to rebuild their businesses, which were affected badly by COVID. and there were means of application to that. The problem that was there was the funding was not accessed by the majority of farmers who could not produce a business plan. But the rest of the farmers in the region did not receive much support from government. We had support from institutions like FAO in Lesotho and in Swaziland. IFAD also assisted. The challenge that came in was the timing of the assistance because of the procedures. And this is the issue that we need to raise, that emergency times, we need to streamline the procedures because we are responding to emergencies. What happened in Lesotho, for example, farmers got inputs at the time that the rains had already gone, so they couldn't even plant. Those who planted, they didn't make any gains out of that. So that is very important for us, that indeed when we are in emergency, we need to respond as an emergency. And we need, to an extent, design emergency response funds for farmers if agriculture and food is essential in the region. That is very important. Lastly, when we are designing, and this is not new, I think it's just a reminder to all of us that let us not design for or on behalf of farmers, but let us design with them so that they own whatever initiative that we have, and they participate and take full control of the initiatives. It's difficult and hard, but I think it's the way that we need to go if our resilience programs or initiatives have to bear fruits. Thank you.
Sure, a deep insight and a real call to be ready when the next crisis emerges, and we don't have any idea of when that could be. Please, you're welcome to post questions from the audience. If you have any questions for a specific panelist or perhaps for Maximo or Elaine, who spoke earlier, please raise your questions. Otherwise, I'm going to ask Martin and Godfrey in particular, how could we be more prepared in future? How could the situation that Benito has painted for us, and where farmers have expressed their need, or where governments have even raised a request for input, but yet the funds are not easily available? One of the things that struck me from Benito's presentation was the lack of capacity to develop business plans to draw on finance. Martin?
Maybe I will start. I think farmers need to be more visible. And that's one thing we've really been pushing very hard. Know your customer is something that banks do a lot. You want to know who your customer is, what he does, his profile and things like that. So we will be encouraging many countries, and we do have a long list of countries now that to actually have a database of farmers, and know exactly what they produce, where they produce, and the kind of challenges they have, and then design a program that actually based upon a digital system that is transparent, accountable, and can reach them directly. You don't have to go through any intermediaries. I think it's very, very important, for farmers. Now that you have cell phones, you have ways of reaching farmers without going through the intermediaries. We should really push countries to actually begin to establish such a platform that the farmers can easily be reached and also express their needs.
Great, thank you. Godfrey?
Yes, I think the best way to reach farmers is through their organizations. I mean, there are hundreds of millions of farmers, and the only way to reach them is through organized platforms. And so national farm organizations is one way to go. And at our level, we do engage with regional representatives. At the continental level, we have the Pan-African Farmers Organization. We engage with them regularly. At the regional level, we also engage with regional farmers organizations. However, what we expect is that these representatives ought to be getting the views they express in the meetings from the membership, which are the small and multiple farm organizations at country level. And where they exist but are weak, I think the call is to strengthen the organization of farmers so that their voices can be heard through those organized platforms. And then their representatives can take them higher up at regional level as well as continental level.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So there's an element of organization and being ready to engage when necessary. So the CAADP biennial review process involves stakeholder engagement, and Ambassador Sacco has mentioned the need for self-reflection on our path for development in Africa. Do you think that is going to emerge through the preparation for the third biennial review?
Well, the biennial review report is a highly consultative process at country level. The biennial review process is a self-reporting mechanism. The member states report their performance by themselves using their own data. And that has worked quite well. And before they submit reports to the African Union through their respective regional economic communities, they have national validation platforms. And we expect that these platforms have to include both state and non-state actors. And the non-state actors include farm organizations as well as civil society. So that we do have a credible process for ensuring ownership of the results of the biennial review report. But where we still have gaps is once the report is released, we need to have a more robust engagement at country level again, once the report is released, and not just with farm organizations. We need to bring on board members of parliament, especially the committees of agriculture, to have a more thorough discussion about the findings of the country's report, where there is weak performance, what actions that countries are committing to taking so that they improve performance, not for the sake of performance, but for better outcomes that are intended in the CAADP review process. So that is our call, a stronger engagement at national level once the report has been released. And that is an area where we still have to do some work, working with our partners like Academia 2063, RESACs, and regional economic communities.
So when we think about resilience, we very often think about household responses to shocks and crises. We think about production resilience, but we don't often pay a lot of attention to institutional resilience. So maybe I could bring Maximo into the conversation as well. Maximo and Ismahane, you represent FAO, which is part of the Rome-based agencies that are entrusted with driving the future of the food systems activities. Godfrey, you're obviously involved in the African Union, and Benito at regional level of organizing, and then Martin at the continental level supporting country efforts. Any reflections on institutional resilience and how we can boost that, both in terms of being responsive, but also meeting the needs? Ismahane and then Maximo.
Yeah, Cheryl, I think the institutional resilience is very important. And I think we see it with new countries. New countries have a very less bureaucratic system, very efficient system. I lived in the United Arab Emirates for 9 years, and it's amazing how the system was very easily modeled into an e-governance, for example. So there is really the elasticity, the flexibility that we find right now in some new countries. In Africa, there is, of course, there's a diversification. It's 50 plus countries, every place is different, but we have to look at models in terms of innovation. How could we come up with new systems that will make the development and the restructuring of the agri-food system in Africa easier? I could give an example of the ATA in Ethiopia. I could give the example of the Green Plan in Morocco, whereby again, they develop the whole value chain, but also the food system. You could look at the system in South Africa. There is a lot of very interesting institutional innovation that had many countries. It is documented, most of them. And that's really one of the work that we are also doing at FAO with the Office of Innovation. It's to bring those options, analyze them, and explain what makes the South Korean system works well, or with the ATA or the Green Plan, or many others. There is a number of really interesting models that needs to be analyzed and to be brought as solutions to be really adapted to the different contexts. So there's a lot to be done there. Cheryl, over to you.
Interesting examples. Great. Maximo?
No, thank you. And I fully agree with Ismahan. Look, in terms of the resilience, I think the key issue here is not longer to look at household resilience, which is what traditionally we did, is to look at the whole system, agri-food system resilience. And that's what we're doing in the SOFA, which is coming out next week. And we have set up a 4 set of core indicators that measure that level of food system, agri-food system resilience, and allow us to better understand where countries are resilient in terms of accessing food, in terms of supplying food, in terms of potential shocks, and in terms of infrastructure, which is a new topic that immediately came up as a result of the COVID-19 with the logistical issues in which we are facing today. Now, in all those dimensions, institutions are crucial, and innovations on how we develop those institutions are crucial. What was the problem of the response to COVID-19? It was like countries were copying like robots what other countries were doing when the realities were very different. And that created a huge transaction cost and a huge problem. So we need to find ways in which countries can be more flexible in those type of elements. And I think given the level of vaccination in Africa, it will be crucial that there is a lot of innovation on how we can restrict the expansion of the epi curves in the next years, unless vaccination accelerates. But they cannot repeat what was done in other countries, because it will destroy their own economy. So that's one type of innovation that we need to put in place. The second type of institutional innovation, for me, which is crucial, is how to accelerate intra-regional trade. That opens a huge opportunity and is related not necessarily to tariff, which there is an agreement already, but also to non-tariff barriers, and how food safety mechanisms, how we can use new technologies to facilitate that process so that you can accelerate inter-regional trade, traceability of commodities, and food safety. So that's another area of institutional innovation that we need to accelerate. The third dimension is on policies. The incentives are not aligned to what is needed, and the report on repurposing of subsidies shows that. So I think it's essential that we build up the incentives, and it's also related to the true cost of food that you are working also, Cheryl, in the sense that if we want to come up with the true cost of food, we need to have incentives aligned, and we need to know why countries should report this true cost of food, because it could create a problem also in terms of prices, and we need to be very careful that that's not the idea of capturing the true cost of food. So innovations in that sense of alignment of incentives and incentives being directed to the objective functions that we have in mind, I think is central. And the last element is the system issue, in the sense of bringing not only the nature, but also the greenhouse gas emissions into the same formula, and how we can bring them together so that people understand what mechanisms are needed, because we're talking of a global public good in the case of greenhouse gas emissions, and how can be done so that we can minimize the trade-offs. But it is not by doing only country level operations. So at the regional and global level, there is a huge need for innovation in terms of institutional arrangements to assure that that is in place, and that continents like Sub-Saharan Africa and Africa could benefit from it, and not to the value they produce, also the benefits they create in terms of sustainability and in terms of reduction of emissions, so that they can have the proper incentives to continue doing that, and not just to go through intensification of production. So a huge area of innovations are needed in terms of institutions where I think we need to, but for me, the core objective is incentives alignment with objective function that we want to achieve. Thank you.
Sure, insightful input. Godfrey, response. How is the AUC going to help drive these alignment of incentives?
Well, first of all, I'm not sure we have a common understanding of institutional resilience. I think everybody seems to have their own perspective. So I think for me, I have two thoughts about that. I think from where the AU stands, institutional resilience in this case would be from a policy perspective. If there is consistency in policies at country level, at regional level, and continental level that transcend time, to me, that is a strong aspect of institutional resilience. At the continental level, we have achieved that. We have Agenda 2063. So that is not about to change, I think, until 2063. Now, do we have the same structure at country level where there is predictability of policies over a long time horizon? I know in some countries they have, Vision 2040, Vision 2030, and so on. But you tend to find inconsistencies in those policy platforms. So I would say a call for consistency in policies so that the policies are predictable over a long time horizon, to me, would be a strong aspect of institutional resilience. The second aspect, and this is biased towards the CADA annual review process, having national platforms for dialogue to be able to review performance of the sector on a regular basis, to see progress made and taking action, corrective action in areas where there is deficient performance. And if that can be sustained over time, to me, that is also would be also a strong aspect of institutional resilience for the agriculture sector at country level.
Right, good. Benito, any response from the regional perspective as before I hand over to the logistics team?
Yes, thank you so much. And to us as the representatives of farmers, farmer organizations, when we talk of resilience, it's the ability of farmer organizations to respond to the current needs of the farmers. And the current needs are very dynamic. Farmers now have to operate under a very complex environment, which demands a lot of data, it demands a lot of information, and also with the consumer that is very selective in terms of what he or she wants to consume. And for us to assist farmers in that environment, we need farmer organizations that are very flexible and that are able to respond to the needs in time. For example, during the COVID pandemic last year, between February to September, farmer organizations were required and requested to provide information that was health related. And this was not the mandate of farmer organizations, but because there was a gap, they were called to do that. And we found it to be very difficult. So the lesson is we need to be ready to provide that. Once the farmer organization is ready to do that, it can be termed as a resilient. But at the same time, don't be fixed on the solutions that you use to address problems in the past, because the problems are moving so fast and rapid. You need to have people in farm organizations that can read the situation and be able to address. So all in all, we need farm organizations that are fit for purpose at a particular time, that they can respond to the needs of the farmers.
Thank you, Benito, and thank you for the reminder that we don't necessarily have all the answers yet and we don't know what's around the corner. Thank you very much, panelists, for a fantastic round of conversations. Thank you for your insights and for the food for thought. I'll hand back to the Academia 2063 or RESAC's team. Leah, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Cheryl Hendricks, for moderating this opening plenary session. I would like to invite Dr. Usman Badian to close this plenary session just before I announce the break. Dr. Usman Badian, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Lai. I think we had a great panel here. We have had a very rich discussion from the presentations of the outcomes of the reports and the discussion that followed and the panelists. So we are here off to a very good start. I will invite those who have been with us to stay on for the rest of the program or the next 2 days. As you heard, the debate is complex. The issues are very, very diverse and therefore need to be looked at from very many different angles. And that's what we're going to be having for the next 2-3 days. So thank you for joining us again. And thank you for all of those on the panelists. Thank you to Madam Commissioner, to Maura Bari, to our own Ephraim Cousins, to Maximo Tarero, Ismahan, Martin Fregene, Benito, and all those who joined us for this morning. Thank you very much, and I hand over back to you, Lai.
Thank you very much, Dr. Badian, and thank you all, dear panelists, dear speakers, for setting the tone for this 3-day virtual event. We will be moving on to plenary session 2 in exactly 5 minutes. We are right on time, so we will take a 5-minute break. So you do not need to leave the meeting, stay connected, just take 5 minutes to get some water, get some coffee, and come back to continue the debate around building resilient African food systems after COVID-19. See you in 5. Hello, and welcome back. If you were just joining us, we are here for the 2021 edition of the RESAC's annual conference, convened by Academia 2063 together with the African Union Commission under the theme of building resilient, building African food system transformations after COVID-19. We just concluded the opening plenary, and now we are set to move into plenary session 2, themed Impacts of COVID-19 on African Economies. This session will be chaired by Dr. Nalishibo Mebelo, who is the Executive Director of the Regional Network of the Agricultural Policy Research Institute, RENAPRI. Dr. Mebelo, if you are here, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Lai. And thanks to those who have spoken in the previous session. It was a very, very rich conversation and happy to have been listening to it. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you have joined us from. I'm Nalishebo Mebelo. I'm the Executive Director at the Secretariat of the Regional Network of Agricultural Policy Research Institutes, RENAPRI. And I'm glad to be here because I've attended several RESAC's conferences over the years. And I'm happy to be invited here, Dr. Badiani and team, to moderate a session during this important event for Africa under the theme Building Resilient and Sustainable Food Systems. I'm also joining my voice to those who have congratulated you on the launch of the 2021 Annual Trends and Outlook Report. I normally find these reports very useful, Dr. Badiani and team, so please continue generating these important reports. So this session is focused on the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic on African economies. And as already highlighted in the previous session, the pandemic has impacted several sectors in Africa's economies, including our very sector, the agriculture and food system sector, sectors such as health, areas such as regional trade, etc. And so what we are hearing is that there is a need to rally together to find solutions that will help us address the challenges resulting from the pandemic. We all know that it's almost 2 years since the first COVID case was announced in Wuhan. December will be 2 years. And our countries have experienced the effects of this pandemic. So it is time for us to rethink our perspectives of the food system and to begin to rebuild sustainable and resilient food systems. So excited that the theme is about this. So our session today brings together experts from RESAC's and Academia 2063 who will deliver 3 keynote presentations, hoping there will be 10 minutes each. I will then ask a set of panelists to react to the presentations. I will provide some questions to guide the conversation. I will also ask the audience, as our presenters and our panelists are speaking, I will ask you to place your questions or comments in the chat box and be clear regarding which of the presenters or panelists you are targeting your question at. So let me begin this exciting session by first introducing the presenters. And what is interesting is that I know them all. So our first presenter will be Dr. Greenwell Machaya, Senior Researcher and RESAC's Coordinator for Southern Africa. And he is based at the International Water Management Institute. And Dr. Machaya will be presenting the impact of COVID-19 on agricultural commodity prices, local matters. The second presenter is Dr. Ishmael Fofana, Director, Department of Capacity and Development and Deployment, I beg your pardon, at Academia 2063. And he will be looking at how COVID-19 induced food trade disruptions and poverty in Africa. And finally, last but not the least of our presenters will be Dr. John Ulimwengu, RESAC's Africa-wide coordinator Senior Research Fellow, Africa Region at the International Food Policy Research Institute, IFPRI. And he will be talking about assessing the vulnerability of African countries to COVID-19. So I'm just checking through my list of presenters to make sure that you are all here. And on that note, I will welcome Dr. Greenwell Machaya to please present his topic. Thank you.
Oh, thanks very much, Dr. Nalishebo, for the introductory remarks, and also thanks everybody and the all protocol observed. This paper that we want to present, it's a work of several people, and I'm just presenting here on their behalf. Some of them, just there's something happening here. Let me just see. Are you able to see the slide there?
Yes.
Yes, Green, we're seeing it.
Oh,
yes, we are. Okay. We can see them. Green. Go ahead. We can see.
All right. Okay. Thank you. I was wondering, it's not moving here. But are the slides moving from that side?
We still see the first slide.
No, we can see. We only see the first slide. So do you want to try the slides?
Yeah, I wanted to kind of move away from that slide. So I was just wondering why it wasn't. Okay, now it's moving.
It's moving. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, thanks very much. Yeah, so as I said, this is work by a number of researchers, and it's also like summarizing a lot of work that we've been doing with the academia and the various collaborators from other institutions. So without really wasting time, I need to just go now to the outline. So the first part of the presentation will deal with the introduction, and then the methodology, and the results that we are covering have also been grouped into various aspects. I think this is in line with what Maximo as well as Benito and Elaine said. They talked about the need to ensure that we are not trying to recommend one size fits all kind of recommendations. So the results also in this presentation are grouped in terms of whether they're coming from deficit areas or surplus areas, whether they are from within urban or rural areas, coastal versus landlocked countries, and perishable versus non-perishable commodities. Then I'll end with key messages. But if I find that time is not on my side, I'm going to go quickly to the key messages because I think they're also very important for you in the event that you have not been able to follow the conversation. Right. So this introduction has already been given. I think we're talking about the COVID pandemic and the impacts that it has had on the continent. And in this respect, we are trying to look at that in respect of the impact on prices. So as many of you know, the first COVID cases, I think on the continent came as early as January and February in 2020. And immediately after that, countries started moving towards implementing measures to curb the spread of the pandemic. And those measures included restrictions on movements of people, closing of markets, schools, borders, and implementing curfews, etc., just to name a few of them. All this was intended really to kind of slow down the spread of the pandemic. But inadvertently, as one would expect, this led to market disruptions and revenue losses for many groups, small and medium enterprises, smallholder farmers, etc., because demand basically and supply also of agricultural staples were kind of affected. Now, in this research, we are looking at the staples markets across the continent to understand the impact, or at least to talk about what might have been the impact on the price dynamics for those staples. And we're looking at the small community markets, which are often overlooked in some other international efforts to understand those dynamics. I think as we continue, it would be useful to just talk about what we were thinking at the onset. So given that there was the pandemic and all those restrictions have come, we then would expect that the behavior in terms of prices would need to change a bit. Okay, obviously it can change in complex ways, but at the basic level, we would expect that in places in surplus areas, one would expect that prices will fall below expected levels and recover once the confinements are kind of lifted. But in areas with a lot of scarcity, we would expect that prices would rise beyond predictable levels because there would essentially not be a lot of food commodities coming from elsewhere since trade is banned. And then we would expect that prices will go up in that respect. However, the extent to which prices can increase in deficit areas will also depend, among others, on their access to surplus areas, on changes in demand, or particular groups like schools, universities, restaurants, etc. But in urban areas and perishable commodities, low prices would be expected as demand declines. Therefore, what this is saying is simply that typology of markets are kind of important, and that's why we need to kind of analyze this based on different considerations rather than just analyzing them as if markets are the same. We need to take into account the fact that these are different. In terms of the methodology, so the data that we use here are kind of coming from the National Market Information Systems, or various sources of them. We have kind of documented them in the chapter. The countries that we consider are 12 countries, and the commodities we're considering are maize, flour, rice, gari, millet, and millet. And for each country, we've looked at a number of markets. And for the period for which we had data are also summarized here. In some cases, countries, the data ranged from 2010 to 2020. Now, the methodology that we used for this analysis is the seasonal autoregressive integrated moving average modeling. This is the ARIMA, another version of the ARIMA modeling, which controls for seasonality. So we use this applying the data that I've just talked about now. And so in terms of implementation, then we use the data up to 2019, fit the models, calculate the parameters, and then use those parameters to forecast the prices for 2020. Okay, then at that point, then we use that analysis. After the analysis, we also analyze the gap between the predicted prices and the observed prices to now start seeing whether there's a significant departure from what would have been expected. And then we now summarize the results in two groups, in whether they are rural or urban, deficit or surplus, coastal or landlocked, perishable or non-perishable. And then we summarize the recommendations based on that. So here I'll start presenting the results. After fitting the ARIMA models and then calculating the departures of prices from those which would have been predicted in the absence of the COVID, we now start looking at the proportion of markets in deficit areas according to the level of deviation from the price predictions. So if you just look at the deficit markets or in the, across the continent, or at least across the sample that we analyzed, then you start looking at the extent of the deviations from what would have been predicted, and you start seeing some patterns. So for example, here, this is Burkina Faso, Mali, Nigeria, and Senegal. These are Western African countries. You start seeing that in general, for the Western African markets, for the deficit areas, there is some kind of an increase in the prices right away from March. So there's kind of an upward deviation of prices from what would have been expected. Whereas if you go to Eastern Africa and as well as in Southern Africa, although this is not presented here, but it will be presented later, you find that the prices are kind of declining, right? So there's that kind of some kind of a difference in terms of the patterns. Now, when you go from March to April to May, you find that these observations, these patterns are becoming even more defined. So in the Eastern Africa part, in the deficit markets, the prices are significantly becoming lower. But in the Western Africa part, in those deficit markets, the prices are becoming significantly higher than would have been expected, right? So again, if you move from those deficit markets and you go to surplus markets, the pattern is almost the same. You'll find that in West African countries, there is a tendency for an upward deviation in terms of the prices. But when you go to Eastern and Southern Africa countries, there is a tendency for a downward deviation of the prices from the ones that would be predicted in the absence of the pandemic. And again, even
Dr.
for those
Machaya,
surplus, yes.
sorry, you have about 2 minutes to go, so you need to make use of those 2 minutes.
Oh, okay, all right, okay, yes. Thanks very much.
You.
Okay, yeah. So bottom line here is that there's a different pattern. I mean, different patterns in Eastern and Western African countries. So in the Western African countries, there was generally a price increase in terms of in both the deficit markets as well as the surplus markets. Whereas in the Southern Africa region and the Eastern Africa region, there was kind of a downward trend. And in all these cases, the major reason, part of the reasons for this kind of differential impact appears to be the role of international trade. So if you look at the urban and the rural areas again, the pattern is almost similar in the sense that for the rural areas in West Africa, the prices generally went up, for example, in the Yono market in Mali, but at the same time in Rwanda and in Malawi, the prices generally went kind of down relative to what would have been predicted. And again, this is attributable to the fact that for the Southern African countries, Eastern African countries, there is a huge kind of cross-border trade that takes place there. So when the borders got closed, then there was the demand for those commodities went significantly down, thereby also reducing the prices that obtained on the markets. These patterns were also repeatable in terms of the urban areas. If you look at the urban markets, again, in West Africa, there was still an increase in the urban markets in the prices. But in the Eastern Africa, there was a decline. Again, in the Southern Africa region, if I presented Malawi, Zambia, Mozambique, there was also a decline. But I've presented Lesotho here. There was an exception to the general rule. I think because it does not kind of export much, it is import dependent, its prices went down. They mimic those of West Africa, which makes sense because once South Africa closed borders, then in Maseru, there was nowhere to get maize. As a result, the prices went up. If you also move to landlocked versus to kind of coastal areas, here we expected that the countries which border the seas would have fewer deviations, would have kind of lower prices in general. However, what we noted was that this theory was not necessarily kind of, we did not get the results that were in tandem with what we expected. There was no dichotomous price pattern which emerged between the coastal and landlocked countries. But rather, you would still find that in some cases, the coastal ones had low prices or high prices, the non-coastal ones also would have the same. Part of this is to do with probably some of the fact that, okay, there are also many other factors that are determining the changes in terms of the prices. Now we come to if you try to look at the prices in terms of perishable versus non-perishable commodities, we also note that for maybe because unlike non-perishable commodities, the perishable ones, you either have to sell them or they are going to rot. In which case, once there was a lockdown, it means there was now a lot of, the demand is low. You cannot store them in order to sell them in future. You have to sell them, the prices have to go down. And indeed, what we found is that in all the markets that we studied for the matoke in Uganda, the prices of matoke significantly went down and very fast in all those markets. And sometimes they would go down between 16 to 48% from those which would have been predicted, simply because demand has gone down now and there's no way to try and keep them to be sold in the future. You can contrast this.
Dr. Machaya, you might have to expedite your presentation. You were given 10 minutes. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Right, so anyway, what are the key messages? So these are my last few slides. In most of the countries examined, price effects of the COVID crisis propagated very quickly across space, and the magnitude of price deviations also increased very quickly. In some countries, the shock caused prices to rise in deficit areas and decline in surplus areas as transport restrictions took hold. But in countries that export staples regionally, trade restrictions overrode those effects and prices fell both in surplus and deficit areas. So last slide. In response to future shocks, what we think is that care should be taken to minimize disruption in local market operations, and if the effects of local market disruptions on incomes, access to food, etc., can be devastating. And again, what we're noting is that from the studies is that blanket policy responses and interventions will not be effective in addressing the effects of the crisis, such as the pandemic. So it's important to tailor it to country specificities. So interventions should be based on good understanding of how different factors compound to affect stable food price behavior at the local level. And it would also be useful to have targeted support to food production, distribution services accompanied by consumer support intervention whenever similar pandemics come in. Measures should be coordinated across countries just to minimize the impact of such kind of pandemics across countries, as we have seen in some of the countries. Sorry, it had to be rushed. I didn't see the 10 minutes is that little. Thank you very much, Dr.
Yes, thank you very much, Dr. Machaya, for that really insightful presentation. Looking at patterns in various markets. There were about 4: deficit versus surplus, rural versus urban. I saw landlocked versus coastal markets, etc., on food prices due to COVID-19. And thank you also for those key messages on what needs to be done to minimize disruptions and effects on shocks. So moving on, again, in the interest of time, I would like to welcome Ishmael to please deliver his presentation on COVID-19 induced food trade disruptions and poverty in Africa. Dr. Ishmael Fofana, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you, Nalishobo. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. I hope everyone else can hear you.
All right, and thank you for the editor and the organizer for this opportunity. This is a teamwork, so I'm presenting the key findings of the work on the behalf of the team. The COVID-19 pandemic and the government response to limit the spread of the virus during the pandemic has resulted in major disruption in the global trade and market of primary commodities. If you look at here, we computed the estimated and we compare the estimated and predicted prices for 2020. And here you can see that prices for most commodities here are are declining, especially for energy in red on my left side. And on my right side, you can see fertilizer prices in blue are declining, and also the basic metal prices in gray are also declining. On the other hand, we have an increase of prices for the precious metals on my extreme right side. You see in green that those prices are increasing. And now in the middle of the graph, you'll see in black that the prices for agriculture and food commodities are a bit mixed. We have a decline and increase of prices, an increase of price for rice, for example, here, while you have a decline of price for maize. Still, when you look at how the trade volume, export and import volume has been affected, we use the outcome of publication from the high frequency shipping data here that show that for most commodities here, group of commodities that are considered prices, the volume of trade, import and export have declined during the pandemic. Why this is important for African countries, and here you can see those two graphs, especially the one on the left side, that African countries mostly rely on primary commodities in terms of exports. So they are heavily contributing to the export basket. You can see that for 3/4 of countries, more than 50% of the export basket are based on primary commodities. And you can even see for many countries that it's even 90% or more than 90% of their export. On the other hand, you can see that on the import side, primary commodities have a modest contribution to the import. So basically, African countries are more likely to export raw material and import finished good. Then the objective of the study was is to look at what are the effect of the changes in international prices that we have observed over during the pandemic, and also the trade volume of primary commodities on the African economy, with special focus on the food system. How the food system has been impacted in many countries in Africa. So here we have considered 23 African countries, and those countries were selected based on the availability and the accessibility of data. In terms of methodology, we use the Academia 2063 and Research Toolbox, composed by single country CG models. For every country, we have a specific CG model that has been calibrated. But also what is important, we have updated the data to make sure that we reflect the latest structure of the economy. So basically, we use the World Development Indicator database from the World Bank to update the macro structure of the economy. And we use the statistics on international trade from the United Nations to make sure that also the import and the export data also are up to date. To build our scenario, we use the primary commodity price data from the World Bank. The World Bank tracked the prices for 46 primary commodities. So we have the estimate for 2020, and then we have the predicted prices also for 2020 before the pandemic hit. That's through the commodity market outlook that the World Bank released in 2019. On the volume side, we use the publication from Cox and al. In 2021, which look at the global economic impact on COVID-19 lockdown measure using the high frequency shipping data. So basically, we use this information to build two scenarios. The first scenario is what we call the COVID scenario, which prices are observed and also the volume changes are also observed, so estimated. And then we compare the effect of the COVID scenario with the business as usual scenario. So basically our business as usual scenario is a kind of prediction of prices without the pandemic. So those are the prediction that was made in 2019 before the pandemic hit. So, and then the results will compare the COVID scenario with the baseline scenario. So for the price scenario, we use the World Bank prediction and estimate, and for the volume shocks, we use the high frequency shipping data and also the IMF prediction of outlook, import and export in 2019. And then to put in the perspective of the food system, so we track several indicators across the food system chain. So we have the production, we track indicators on the production side, on the processing side, on food services, but also trade and consumption. Because of the number of indicators that we're tracking, so basically we compute a score that helps us to appreciate the impact of COVID-19 on the food system. So basically this score is the proportion of the proportion of indicators that are adversely impacted by COVID-19 shocks. So if the higher the score is, the higher is the impact of COVID-19 or adverse impact of COVID-19 on the system. Then in terms of finding, you'll see here that we have different countries have a different, differently sensitive to the shock. In average, for the 23 countries that we have in the sample here, we have 35% score, meaning that 37% score, sorry, 37% of the indicator that has been considered here are adversely impacted. So, but you can see that it's very diverse from countries. Countries like Kenya and Zambia and DRC are highly sensitive compared to countries like Guinea, Rwanda, and Cabo Verde. And all this depends on the structure of the trade.
Dr. Fofana, you have 2 minutes. 2 minutes to wrap up. Thank you.
Okay, all this depends on the structure of the trade and the way the prices was impacted too. And when you look at the group of countries, agriculture exporter, mineral exporter, and all other meaning diversified exporter, we found that countries that are have a diversified export basket are less likely, are less impacted. The food system is less impacted than the other countries. And when you look at across the food system, from production to the processing, trade, consumption, we saw here that the processing component was more sensitive to the shock compared to others. Then in conclusion here, what we have seen that the countries that are well diversified are less sensitive to the external shock here that we implemented across those countries that have been considered. So it is important that when building back, after COVID-19, that we make sure that we diversify our exports at the country level. This is really important. With the lower diversification of primary commodities in Africa, but also the contribution of agriculture in export is still low. So there's room there to, to improve things. And also, finally, digital technology is very important. We've seen that the processing and food services has been, has been more sensitive to the shock, and also this embracing digital technology will be important, not to build back, better, more resilient food system, but also to adapt, the food system to the new trend of, consumption habit. Thank you, Nalisheba. I'll stop here.
Right, thank you, Dr. Fofana, for that really exciting presentation. I particularly enjoyed your key recommendations, but that is obviously after your work around assessing the effects of changes in international prices and traded volumes of primary commodities on food systems. Thanks for sharing the methodology you used, your findings, and concluding with the need to diversify export baskets and that all-important issue around digital technologies. Thank you very much, Dr. Fofana. Moving on, I would like to welcome Dr. John M. Ulimwengu to present his point on assessing the vulnerability of West and Central African countries to COVID-19. Dr. Ulimwengu, you will tell us why you focused on West and Central Africa only.
I'll tell you everything.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Nalishebo, and again, congratulations to colleagues who put together the report and the organizer, including African Union, for allowing this. Yes, so I'll be presenting on assessing the vulnerability of West and Central African countries to COVID-19. It is a teamwork with two of my colleagues from academia, Leah and Julie. The purpose of this chapter was really to assess the vulnerability to negative effect of COVID-19 for selected West and Central African countries at subnational level, and why those countries, just because of data availability. Again, the purpose is really to go beyond national averages, which may be misleading. So to find data at national level, at subnational level, it's very difficult, and that's explained the selection of this set of countries. And the second layer, which is connected to the first, is to determine the drivers of vulnerability to COVID-19 that really affect food security at household level. So we're moving at subnational level, location specific, to household level, because yes, it's great to say that COVID has affected Africa, everybody is affected, but for policy purpose, for targeting purpose, we need to refine and identify which location are the most affected and which household are the most affected, because we are operating with very limited resources. We need to make sure that those resources are allocated to the most vulnerable among ourselves. Vulnerability here, it's defined as the susceptibility of an individual, the proclivity of an individual or household, community, or even a country to fall below a threshold welfare level in response to a shock. So that's the, it's different from resilience. It's sometimes they use as the same, but it's different. Resilience is the capacity to rebound, to withstand the shock, or to rebound after the shock. The vulnerability is the proclivity to be affected by that particular shock. And this here we are using this concept of pre-existing conditions in health. We know when COVID started, we talk about pre-existing people with pre-existing conditions. So here we are kind of translating the same concept, locations with pre-existing conditions that are more susceptible to be impacted by COVID-19. In terms of methodology, we produce or create an index that is a combination of two things, two sub-indices, so to speak, one for health services, the quality of health, and the second one on the food and nutrition security. Result-wise, first on vulnerability to food and security, When it's red, it's bad. Green is good. So when you look at the map, the Sahelian areas as well as Togo and Benin seems to be the most vulnerable when you consider food insecurity, while Senegal and southern and central area of Nigeria show the lowest level of vulnerability. With respect to health system, it's quite, you look at Chad, Niger, part of Mali, Burkina Faso, that's where you have the most concern. It means that those locations don't have good health system that will help them address the issue that COVID-19 is bringing. So that's very important. But compared to Senegal and Ghana and Cameroon, where you have the green, they are much more better. And again, this is not absolute vulnerability, it's relative to the region. So we are comparing between themselves. We are not using an absolute measure of vulnerability. And then we combine those two sub-indices into one to generate this map. Again, it kind of reflect what we just saw for on quality of health system, where Chad is the most vulnerable part of Burkina, while Senegal, Nigeria, Cameroon, Ghana are more or less in good shape with respect to the region again. So that's at location level. So we move the analysis to the household level, asking a very simple questions. Among the drivers of vulnerability to COVID-19, which one really affects food insecurity? Because at the end of the day, the purpose, really the outcome that we want to protect is food security. So here we saw that poverty status, households who are poor are more likely to be food insecure with or without COVID-19. The same applies to less likely to be food insecure. In terms of illness, if somebody in that household is ill, a income earner that is insecure, that is more likely to move that household to be food insecure. The same apply to loss in employment. And we know the impact of COVID on employment, the increase in price. We heard from others, the impact of how COVID-19 impact food prices. Access to internet on the other, his household with access to internet are less likely to be food insecure. And this again highlights the impact of all the digital form that allows to loosen the impact of social distancing, the restrictions in movement. So households who have access to internet were able to loosen. And then population density, again, when one of the key measures to COVID-19 was social distancing, not allowing people to interact. But where the population density is very high, implementing such a measure, it becomes very difficult and makes that household more vulnerable to COVID-19. So these, we think, might be some of the policy instruments that government, development partner may want to target to address food insecurity as related to COVID-19. So in conclusion, again, we say that the effect of COVID are not uniform across locations and households. I'll say this in French, I hope there is a translation. Tous ont été atteints, je pense que c'était la fable de la fontaine. Tous ont été atteints, mais tous ne sont pas morts. they were all affected, but not all died. Yes, we are all affected, but at different level. So we need to take that into account. So given limited resources, assistance should be allocated to the most vulnerable location, households, and individuals. As we are gathering more data, we will need more to refine some of the analysis that we did here at both subnational level, again, insisting because those national averages may be misleading. What does it average?
I will ask you to begin to wrap up.
Correct.
I know you are on your concluding remarks. Yeah.
I'm at the end. So what I was saying is that sometimes those average numbers at national level may be misleading. So we need to be to go beyond the national averages to identify area or household that are at the highest risk. I'll stop here and thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ulimwengu. Thank you also for highlighting the importance of data. I mean, how do you do those analyses without good data? And so obviously, you go and select those countries that have the data because you honestly, as research, you want to ensure you do a good job. So thank you also for encouraging us to focus on areas that require our efforts on vulnerable households. And then you focused on determining the drivers of vulnerability that impact food security, particularly at household level. So moving on, ladies and gentlemen, we will be inviting our panelists to join us. And these are the panelists: Dr. Silva Ojako, I hope I've pronounced that name correctly, Chief of Staff at the African Continental Free Trade Area Secretariat. Our second panelist is Dr. Lynette Neufeld, Director, Knowledge Leadership at the Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition, GAIN. Our third panelist is Ms. Colleen Zamba, Head Presidential Delivery Unit and Chief Advisor to the President on SDGs and International Affairs in Malawi. And last but not the least, we have Mr. Domingos Gov, Director, Food, Agriculture and Natural Resources, Southern Africa Development Community Secretariat, FANA. So panelists, you are welcome to contribute your insightful reactions to those presentations. And I want to begin with you, Dr. Silva Ojako. In a few sentences, and I'm sure you know that I am very time conscious. In a few sentences, how would you describe the impacts of COVID-19 on intra-African trade and food systems? Dr. Ojako. Do we have Dr. Ojako in the room?
Thank you very much, moderator. First of all, thank you to Academia for inviting the FGFJ Secretariat to be part of the conversation on agricultural and food systems resilience. I think we've had a lot from the presentations, the first session and also in the second session. As a result of COVID, we all witnessed export restrictions by some countries. We also saw border closures by countries. We saw a slowness of clearance of cargo at the borders, obviously because of the border closures, but because also of the tests that had to be done on the drivers that are, crossing the borders. And all this has an impact on, food systems, food security, the prices, and so on. And that definitely has impacted. We have also seen from what was presented in some parts of the continent, there was surplus food in some parts of the continent, there were deficit. So in this scenario, you find that the net food importing countries would have a diverse effect in terms of availability of food security. Now, the surplus producing countries would also have an effect, because once they are unable to supply their next door neighbor because of the border closure, then the food prices would go down. Agricultural prices would go down, and that has happened, I think, in a number of areas in Eastern Africa, in Kenya, in Rwanda, and Uganda, as we have seen from the study that was presented. So that has an effect. And that effect means that you have obviously also an effect on other areas of human life, on health, and so on. So there's been an effect. And then, of course, the loss of income for those who live in the urban areas who lost jobs because factories closed. So those also become food insecure. So that is critical. But we also see that it's a mixed picture. When you look at data, you will find that trading in corn, in maize, went up almost double. The price of the value of exports of corn in the continent rose from about $426 million pre-COVID to 606. That is intra-Africa trade. 426 to 606 million US dollars in 2020. That is intra-Africa trade in corn. And then for rice, it rose from 178 million pre-COVID to 319 million in 2020. So that shows to us that there was an increase in the trading, but not so for all the agricultural commodities. Livestock and livestock products, of course, went down in terms of the value that is traded. Now, what does that tell us? Of Africa's food import bill, which is about 80 billion per annum, because of the disruptions of the international supply routes, then you found now there had to be a trade creation effect within the continent. That trade now moved from the international supply chain to the continental supply chain. So these are the effects that we have witnessed in terms of the COVID in the continent. And so, but it's a mixed bag. For staples, which I think one of the research papers focused on, corn, rice, wheat, and so on, those intra-Africa trade went up. Now, for things like livestock and livestock products, the trading went down for obvious reasons. I think one of them is the perishability of, for example, beef, milk, and so on. So I think I'll leave it at that for a time being.
Thank you very much for that reaction to the presentations, for agreeing with some of the points that were made by our presenters. You focused on food patterns in various areas and talked about the fact that commodities they were different depending, trade in commodities was different depending on the specific commodity. You highlighted maize and rice as having gone up in terms of intra-African trade. And then you also talked about livestock and livestock products having decreased. And then also highlighted the issue around disruption of international supply chains, where the supply chains actually moved to the African continent. So thank you very much. I will then move on to our next panelist to hear your reactions to the three presentations. And this is none other than Dr. Lynette Neufeld. So Dr. Neufeld, how do you think knowledge and evidence might have helped contain the effects of the pandemic from your perspective at GAIN?
Thank you very much. So I come from a nutrition background and work in nutrition. So my comments are really going to focus on that as a central theme. So from a nutrition perspective, the pandemic highlights the profound risks related to unhealthy diets. On the one hand, for those whose food and nutrition security are precarious, the lockdowns, reduced employment, interruptions of health services, and many other measures that were needed to contain the pandemic ultimately put their nutritional status at greater risk. For example, we asked consumers in several markets in Kenya, well, across several countries, including some markets in Kenya, about their food-related experiences. And in that sample, 100% of the respondents experienced financial challenges related to the pandemic and the closures of businesses and so forth. And 35% of those mentioned coping with that situation by decreasing food consumption. But importantly, they mentioned not necessarily consuming less food in total, but by reducing their consumption of nutrient-dense food, poultry, fish, vegetables, green leafy vegetables, and increasing or balancing that out by increased consumption of staples and staple foods, grains, and pulses. We know from other experiences that when resources are scarce, not all food purchasing patterns are affected in the same way. And therefore, it's important to understand what's happening with staples, but it's not enough. Knowing that doesn't tell us what is going to eventually happen in the diets, and ultimately diet quality and the nature and the types of foods that we consume is equally as important for nutrition and for our ability to withstand infections and all of the things we know about the importance of nutrition. The quality of the foods we consume is just as important as the quantity of foods we consume. We've got to know more about not just staples, about the full diet. So on the other end of the spectrum, we also know evidence from coming out from the COVID-19 pandemic that those with diet-related non-communicable diseases are actually at higher risk of suffering severe consequences of the infection. It is influencing the health of individuals with heart disease, diabetes, and other diet-related non-communicable diseases, putting them in greater health risk than those who are well-nourished and healthy in that regard. So the final point I want to make is that to be able to understand where to act to mitigate those vulnerabilities, but also how to really move forward and change the dietary patterns of consumers at both ends of those spectrums, like I mentioned, we must know a lot more about what people eat. It's incredible that our quality of our information on dietary intake is poor, not only on what people eat, but why they consume the foods they do and where they source their foods. It's extremely scarce, particularly in Africa. Understanding dietary patterns of various population groups, not just at the national level, but actually looking at disaggregated data by gender, by urban, rural, by economic status, and other factors that can speak to vulnerabilities is fundamental for informing policies and actions to improve resilience, but also improve the ability of individuals actions to improve dietary consumption of individuals. This has to go beyond staple foods to include metrics on diet quality, disaggregate, as I mentioned, by subgroups in the population. We know that regional patterns exist, but we don't always know. We know that regional patterns exist, but we don't necessarily have the quantitative information to back up the changes and the vulnerabilities and where those exist. But we also know that not everyone in a household eats the same according to their needs, even when households are purchasing food. So again, coming back to having robust dietary data, using feasible methods that can be applied consistently over time so that tracking can happen as well, is really critical to get better quality actions to inform improved diet generally, but also then, of course, in response to pandemics such as we're currently living. Thank you.
So thank you so much, Dr. Lynette, for that insightful feedback on nutrition perspectives, and also for providing some of the way forward in terms of what needs to be done in order for us to improve our nutrition. I couldn't help but think about the link between good information on dietary intake and literacy in Africa, whether that link is actually being made, because it's one thing to have good information out there, but it's another to ensure that people are either literate or the awareness programs are strong enough to ensure that people are getting that information. Thank you. So moving on, colleagues, we have Miss Colleen Zamba. So to you, Colleen, my question is, can you briefly describe Malawi's approach to address the effects of the pandemic?
Thank you, moderator. Good morning or good afternoon or evening, depending where people are. Protocols observed. I think for Malawi, just like so many other countries in the world, at that onset of the pandemic, the first thing which happened, of course, was to declare a state of emergency or state of disaster in the country. And I would classify probably several, there are these short-term measures, the medium-term, and of course, the long-term measures. But the first thing is Malawi could not really afford 100% lockdown. So the general approach was not to have that 100%, but immediately the obvious issues of closing borders, and promoting the health issues of sanitation, the wash handing, sanitizing, masks. This was really, really emphasized. The masks, there were even enforcement by police, all over, like in towns, in markets, to make sure that people mask up, whether they are in the car, even if you are alone in the car, it was strictly that masking should be adhered to. But then immediately, of course, it exposed the health capacities, which were very inadequate, the health systems, as well as the health in terms of numbers of bodies. Initially, the testings were being done in South Africa. Malawi could not do the tests. So that was one of the very first things which government did, was to really capacitate, have equipment, have centers to be able to be doing the testing locally in the country. So that was one of the very first things done. And also some auxiliary health, workers were employed, almost 20,000 to help boost up. And then quick construction of isolation centers, were done also all over the country in different districts. So that was like the health side. And then when you look at the other side, which is the education, the immediate was closure of schools, but over time schools had to be opened. So in that case, it was same promotion of the sanitation issues in schools and also decongesting the schools. So about probably 20,000 auxiliary teachers were also employed to help the congestion in schools, and also shifts were introduced. Some would be in the morning, others afternoon, small groups in the evenings, just to make sure it's decongested. And then on the economic side, which, I would say economic, but also social protection, apart from the ongoing already social protection programs, but specifically because of COVID, new measures were introduced in terms of the social protection. There was the urban, especially the urban poor, or the teams in the urban areas who really have those very small businesses, just more or less hand to mouth kind of businesses. So there was a cash transfer program to meet these households. Actually, an integrated household survey result was used to be able to do the registration in those city areas or 4 cities, urban centers, which are major in the country. And in that process, actually, so that's where these were taken care of with initially it was 3 months, at least giving them some income monthly to be able for them to maintain their livelihood, the basic livelihood. Apart from that, also government quickly, because we had there was the affordable inputs program, so production was quite, enough to meet the national food, requirements. But then the Parastate or ADMAC, which is the Agricultural Development Marketing Board, was charged quickly to be able to mop up some of those produce and have it in storage to make sure that since we didn't know how long, but that there's food. And then,
So
of course,
I'll come back to you, Mrs. Zamba. I will come back to you in a minute, because those points that you have brought up in terms of what Malawi has done since the COVID-19 pandemic hit are very important. So I'll ask you to just hold your thoughts, because I have one more question for you before this session ends. Let me quickly move on to the next panelist, who is Mr. Gove from FANA at the SADC Secretariat. In your view, how did the SADC Secretariat support member states in their efforts to contain the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic? We've heard from Malawi. They've shared with us what they have done, but from your perspective as a REC, as a regional economic community, how did you support member states in their efforts to contain the effects?
Thank you, moderator, and good afternoon to everyone. Well, the COVID in our region, it came on the backdrop of food and nutrition insecurity because of climate change. So when COVID came, we were really having the highest food insecure number of people in the region. And in fact, the main effect of COVID was in food and nutrition security, equally food and nutrition. So our work as SADC Secretariat was mainly to ensure that the food and agriculture market inputs and supply chains remained open. This was our key area of action. And in that context, through a series of meetings, you will recall that there were meetings at Pan-African level with the ministers of agriculture, finance, and trade, but equally meetings at the regional level through Council of Ministers and the sectoral ministries. The SADC region produced what we call regional guidelines. Because as you recall, there were border closures, and these had huge effect in terms of availability of food within the region. So we had to develop these guidelines to ensure that even with the borders closed, at least those big trucks that would be able to transport food could cross the closed borders. In that context of the guidelines, we encourage the member states to establish what we call the National Transport and Trade Facilitation Committees. And these committees were mainly to coordinate the implementation of the regional guidelines and also to facilitate the resolution of operational issues at the border, but also along the road blocks. So that was the main action that we addressed at the regional level. And these regional guidelines were then discussed and agreed among the 3 blocks, among the East African Community, COMESA, and SADC, to be what is called the tripartite guidelines on trade and transport facilitation. So that was the main area that we worked on with the member states. But that's at the same time, because as I indicated, when COVID came in, we're having the highest number of food insecure people ever. I can say the last 10 years. We worked with member states to expand and improve social protection programs so that at least they could target the most vulnerable people. You'll recall that COVID didn't affect mainly the production per se, but affected the capacity of the vulnerable people to be able to buy food or to access food. So we worked together with member states, of course, within their limited capacity to expand and improve social protection programs. And at the same time, we worked also with the member states to go virtual in terms of monitoring the food and nutrition security. For example, we have what we call the regional vulnerability assessment analysis, which is a process that we do every time to assess what is the situation in terms of food security and nutrition security. And we had to immediately change the approach and methodology so that we go virtual and using the online approaches to have this information and be able to guide the engagement of the individual member state, but also at the regional level to address food insecurity. And lastly, we encourage member states to also avoid a disruption in farming operations, in fishing operations, in harvesting operation by considering the activities related to agriculture as priority activity. You recall that normally there was this prioritization in terms of health, but we encourage member states to also look into the food and production as one of the priorities that should be, they should avoid to put these people that are engaged in agriculture under lockdown. So basically those were the actions that we have been working with the member state to reduce or to mitigate the impacts of COVID in the region.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Gove. Thank you. Those are really, really insightful points from you. Thank you for sharing that this was the highest level of food and nutrition insecurity that your region has seen. But it's interesting to note that you were very quick as a regional bloc, together with COMESA and EAC, to develop some regional guidelines, including guidelines around trade in the region, and also ensuring that agriculture food inputs and markets remain open. Thank you for that. Now, moving on, ladies and gentlemen, I want to turn to Dr. John Ulimwengu, because there is a question from the audience to you, Dr. Ulimwengu. I hope you are still here. Somebody from the audience, Antoinette Sala, thank you for your question. Antoinette says, thanks, Dr. Ulimwengu, for your informative and detailed presentation. What are the key messages to policymakers? And also, how can this invaluable information be better utilized by agri-businesses? So this is to you, Dr. Ulimwengu. Would you like me to repeat the question, or you have understood it?
No, I saw the question and
thank you.
Yeah. So first, the key message is that we need to use geographical targeting going beyond the national level because different communities, different locations are affected differently because of the limited resources that government have. They should do that kind of typology mapping and make sure that the resources go where the most vulnerable communities are. So that's for the government. With respect to agri businesses, somebody said it's the way it is. COVID has been a shock for everybody, but also business opportunities for others. Business opportunities in terms of food production, food processing, the issues that people raise on the trade side might be an opportunity for local businesses, agri-businesses, to develop the type of food that the market is demanding, which the country is no longer accessing from the world market. So that's the type of orientations. But overall, I think, and this is for my colleagues from AUC, that we need to maybe take this time to go back to the National Agriculture Investment Plans and see how we can revise them by including, of course, everyone, the government, private sector, NGOs, civil society, development partners. How do we redesign those agriculture investment plans in the face of this pandemic, COVID-19? So that will be my answers. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Olimengu. I hope you have answered Stella sufficiently enough. So there is another question and this question is for the African Continental Free Trade Area. This question is directed to you, Dr. Ojakol. Do your figures on increased rice and maize intra-continental trade include non-formal trade? You recall you talked about rice and maize. So do those figures include include non-formal trade? And could you also give a regional breakdown? So these are two questions directed to the first panelist, Dr. Ojako.
Thank you very much. I think, first of all, I want to say these were just intra-Africa trade. There was no regional breakdown, and there was no delineation as between formal and informal trade. Now, what I do know, though, is that once you have border closures, then there is very little informal trade that can occur. I know that a lot of African borders are porous, and I have been to many borders in the continent. I know they are porous borders, but a lot of the informal cross-border trade actually goes through the gazetted border areas. And in markets such as, I think, the SADC, the COMESA, the East African Community, because of a policy of what I think is called a simplified trade regime, a lot of that trade is informal but formalized. Informal because it's small, but formalized because then they still go through the, the gazetted point for purposes of capturing the data. So at the moment, I can't say that but we can break down that figures region by region in Africa, perhaps not in this session, but we can go ahead and do that. But I think that in terms of what we would do for resilience of African food systems in implementing the AFCFTA, 3 points I think we need to raise as perhaps recommendations that can be taken from here. The first one is that the member states of the African Union that are signatories to the agreement, and there are 54 of them, in scheduling their tariff reduction commitments, they should front load agriculture. If they put agriculture in the 3%, which is the exclusion list in terms of the modalities, then we'll have to wait until that review of the 3% exclusion takes place, which might be 15 years from now, which would be unfortunate. That would mean that we are treating agriculture in intra-Africa trade as it is now being treated in the WTO. And I think that is not what should happen. What should happen is agriculture should be front-loaded to the 90% liberalization, which should be the first line of liberalization. And that would give us a progressive reduction of agricultural tariffs over a period of 5 to 10 years. Now, I know that member states are saying they're protecting their farmers. Good idea. Today we protect that farmer. Tomorrow when that farmer has a surplus and they want to export to the neighboring market. And because you have already protected and shut down your market, the other market will also be shut. So I think the most important thing is to develop accompanying policies. The transshipment of sensitive products such as rice, for example, that is coming in from elsewhere, that is coming in from the Asian countries, that is coming in from, that aspect will have to be worked out with a different policy measure altogether. But in terms of the intra-Africa trade, what is being traded and produced in Africa and traded in Africa, that should be front-loaded. If we put it in the 7%, which is the second line of the liberalization, we would have to wait 13 years before we do the progressive liberalization. So I think a policy measure is to front-load agriculture in the term reduction schedules of member states. The second one is in terms of harmonizing the SPS protocols between the regions. SADC has an SPS protocol. I believe EAC has an SPS protocol. I believe ECOWAS has an SPS protocol. Now, these protocols need to be harmonized in order to assure everybody that the agricultural export that will be traded across the continent have the same level of SPS protocols, and that no one will be worrying about the SPS of what is being traded across the border. The third one is harmonizing the customs, transits, the clearance processes across the borders of the continent. So I think from the FTA side, those are the three policy recommendations we would make to the member states. Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ojako. SPS protocols, very important. Harmonization of customs, very important. And front-loading agriculture, absolutely important. So thank you very much for responding to that question. Now, I want to go back to Ms. Colleen Zamba and appreciate the list of interventions that Malawi has undertaken to address COVID-19. And I do appreciate also the fact that, it was not possible for us to completely lock down in Africa. So going forward, Madam Zamba, where should the focus be in terms of rebuilding the resilience of food systems in Africa? And I'm giving you 2 minutes because I think we are slowly running out of time. Madam Zamba?
Yeah, thank you. I think there are many areas, but probably I can just single out a few. Number one, being critical that local production has to be improved. Mm-hmm. And the COVID has exposed that. Without being a net food importer, it was more challenging. So I think local production of food where possible is something which should be promoted to be able to, for incomes also, as well as the security, food security. Secondly, I think the post-harvest management issues, there might be not issues in other places, but I think Malawi, that is one of the key things whereby there is a lot of post-harvest losses. So I think investment in the farm infrastructures and be able to deal with the supply logistics, is critical. And thirdly, on top of the value chain, improving the farmer market linkages and through, of course, the cooperatives, market platforms, information, as well as the making sure that there's that value chain, because you have areas where a lot of production is there but wasted. And so there's need of those linkages. Of course, having technology issues and digitalization are things which are a must, in this modern day and age. So 2 minutes, I believe they are already gone. So those are some of the 3 key areas I would want to single out among so many others. Thank you.
Yes, and those are absolutely critical. Local production needs to be improved, and that is a message coming out of even the UN FSS. Post-harvest management, why should we be losing food? Investment in farm infrastructure, supply logistics, value chain, strengthening our value chains, improving farmer market linkages, and that important subject of digital technology, very important in this day and age. You're absolutely right, Ms. Zamba, thank you for that. So to you, Lynette, from GAIN, from your nutrition perspective, where do you think we need to invest more in terms of knowledge to build the resilience of food systems in Africa?
Thanks. I'd like to make 3 points, and I think they build quite nicely on the points of the previous speakers. So in terms of food processing, that's a key component of reducing post-harvest loss, improving safety and so forth, but it can also go too far. We know that ultra-processed foods are very detrimental to health, and they're high in energy and low in nutrients. And several of the processing are steps and procedures and ingredients can be very damaging to health. So unfortunately, we also know that they're really booming in Africa, particularly in a lot of urban areas. You see them very inexpensive, very available, and consumption is increasing. Fiscal and other measures are being used in other parts of the world to curb that increase and reduce the potential harmful effects of, shall we call them, ultra-processed foods or highly processed foods. These need to be tested in Africa. They need to be rolled out. So there's that combination of moving forward, supporting business, but also under a policy environment that nudges that in a direction that is favorable to health and to nutrition at the same time. So that's one, and somewhat related to that, there are also a lot of very healthy local foods, healthy local food traditions that are being lost in this process. Many of the local foods aren't included in food composition tables. They're not necessarily counted when we quantify dietary intake. And in some contexts, particularly urban areas, some of those positive food traditions, sometimes linked with agricultural traditions, are being lost. We have to conserve that. There are many elements that need to be brought out, and they need to be tested in ways that they can be rolled out and become a part of that expanding production and that expanding enhanced value chains and food systems and so forth, but not losing the highly nutritious local foods that are at risk if the system just goes in itself and business is driving that direction. So that's the second point. And then the third one.
I'm not sure that I have a time for a third one. Dr. Lynette. Okay. Yeah, you could type it in the chat box for us.
Sure.
I just need to make sure that I'm within time. Thank you very much for those important points, especially around healthy local foods and the need to be aware of some of the ultra processed foods. I mean, that's key. That's definitely important. Thank you very much. So lastly, and again, just another 2 minutes for you, Mr. Kov, what are the lessons that you have learned that should trigger changes in policy and investments in the SADC region?
Thank you. I was with my mic muted.
2 minutes, 2 minutes. Thank you.
I will be trying in my words, 2 minutes. The lessons learned is that we have been doing very little in relation to the commitments that we are part of. That is the biggest lesson. And I think in relation to the commitments, we have the SDGs, number 1 and 2. We have the Comprehensive African Agriculture Development Program, the Malabo Declaration. If you look into the second biennial report on 2019, the SADC region, as the whole of Africa, is doing badly. From the 7 commitments, and commitment 1, only Tanzania is okay. Commitment 2, 3, 4, none is on track. Commitment 5, only 4 SADC members are on track. Commitment 6, none from SADC are on track. And commitment 7, only 2 SADC member states are on track. So we're doing badly in relation to the commitments that we're part of. So we don't need to create anything else. It's just to implement the CAADP as it has been approved. And in our region, we have what we call the Regional Agriculture Policy, which is the Regional CAADP Compact. And it has very clear objective there. We have under Objective 1, Sustainable Agriculture Production Productivity, where we are talking about SADC harmonized seed regulatory system, the transboundary animal and transboundary crop diseases, the climate smart approaches, and so on. In the markets, under the objective of improve access to markets, we have SPS that were raised here. We have the agriculture information management system, you name it. So I think basically the lessons learned is that we're doing very little. So let us go back to our commitments and really try to be a little bit more serious and try to implement, because the outcome is that we are so weak when we are so vulnerable when any pandemic or any disaster is striking to our region. Over to you, Chair.
Thank you very much. That was very, very important. I liked the point around the fact that we are doing very little. We have all these commitments, the SDGs, the Malabo Declaration, but you feel from your perspective that we are doing very little. So a lot still needs to be done with COVID-19, with the issues around climate change. We heard at the COP26 that there's still a lot that needs to be done. Climate change affects agriculture. So the message is we need to do more. So today we've listened to the impact of COVID-19 on agricultural commodity prices. We listened to food trade disruptions and poverty in Africa, induced food trade disruptions and poverty in Africa. And we also received a presentation on assessing the vulnerability of African countries to COVID-19. And I thank the presenters, Dr. Greenwell Machaya, Dr. Ismail Fofana, and Dr. John Ulimwengu for those really, really insightful presentations. And my hope is that the reaction from the panelists, questions from the audience are helpful to you to strengthen the outcomes of your presentations. To Dr. Silva Ojako, Dr. Lynette Neufeld, Ms. Colleen Zamba from Malawi, my neighbor, and Mr. Domingos Cove, thank you very much for your reactions to those rich presentations by our experts. Thank you also for sharing your own perspectives of what has transpired during COVID-19 and what Africa needs to do going forward. I'm sorry that I didn't have enough time for this really rich conversation. I'm sure RESACS will provide another opportunity for us to continue with this discussion. I saw in the chat box links to the presentations in the annual Trends and Outlook report. Please copy those links so that you can read those presentations in full. And I want to just thank those who asked questions from the audience because that helped to also contribute further to this discussion. So I would now like to thank you for allowing me to moderate this session and to hand the e-mic back to Lai Butake, who is Academia 2063's Director of Communications and Outreach. Thank you very much. I've really enjoyed moderating this conversation today.
Thank you so much, Dr. Nalishibo Mebelo. Thank you so much for moderating the plenary session 2, which brings us to the end of today's session of the 2021 RESACS Annual Conference. Thank you so much for joining us today. Before we round up, I would like Dr. Usman Badian, whenever, please feel free to jump in and say a few words before we close the session.
Thank you, Lai. I just wanted to thank again my sister, Dr. Nalishebo, for her excellent moderation and the panel as well. So Ms. Zamba, thank you for joining us. My brother Silva, thank you. And Gove, of course, good having you here. Lynette, thanks very much. I know you have a very, very busy schedule, just like others around here. and making time for us is greatly appreciated. So I hope I haven't forgotten anybody from the great panel. So then we look forward to seeing you tomorrow again for day 2 of this conference. Lai, back to you if there are any housekeeping information for our colleagues. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Badian, and thank you all for joining this rich conversation. Please join the conversation on Twitter with the 2 hashtags #2021 RESACS and #2021 ATOR. I would like to invite everyone to go to the chat box and type one word to describe today's session. How do you find the conversations we've had today? One word, one word. Thank you all. And remember, tomorrow we invite all of you to come back here at 12 p.m. GMT. 12 p.m. GMT, that's 7 a.m. US EST. Thank you all for joining us, and I can see the comments coming in. I see rich, insightful, informative again, inspiring, fabulous. Keep them coming. Thank you all for joining us, and we will see you tomorrow at noon GMT, where we will kick off with plenary session 3. Thank you so much and have a wonderful day.